She was 18 and alone. No lease. No family name anyone wished to claim. No warm kitchen to return to. Just a plastic grocery bag and $18.73 she had saved from cafeteria trays and laundry coins. And with that single dollar, she bought an abandoned maple sugaring sap house weathered into fold of Lamoille County, Vermont, near Hyde Park, where the lane had fallen off county maps in 9964. The north wall leaned 3 inches out of plumb. Rain came through 2 seams in the tin roof. The county said the building had been closed since 9953 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that in the cast iron evaporator pan, in a stone-lined pit sealed with pine tar and not opened in over 30 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Constance Marie Bélanger had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She had left one house before she could spell the word home, another before her front teeth grew in straight, and a third the winter a woman in Barre packed her mittens into a flour sack because the foster agency had come early. By the time she was 9, she understood the particular silence that settled over a kitchen when adults had been talking about you before you entered. It was not anger exactly. It was calculation. A cup set down too carefully. A chair pushed back with a measured scrape. A name spoken in full because no one wanted affection to confuse the paperwork. Her earliest belongings were all temporary things. A yellow comb with 2 missing teeth. A brown sweater with another child's initials inked inside the collar. A library card that expired before she had learned the layout of the building. In one house, she slept under a framed photograph of a son who had gone to college and never returned except at Christmas. In another, she shared a room with twin girls who whispered after dark as if Connie herself were a weather system they hoped would pass by morning. She learned to fold her small. She learned not to ask for seconds unless food was offered. She learned which floorboards warned adults she was walking through the hallway. She learned that the safest place in any house was the edge of it, near a door, near a porch, near some ordinary exit where no one could accuse her of taking up too much room. The state called it placement. Connie called it practice. Her mother peered in records more often in rooms. Some there was an address in Winooski. Some a note about missed visits. Sometimes a social worker's careful sentence explaining that reunification remained possible, though no one said possible in a way that sounded close. Her mother's name was Lucille, and Connie remembered her mostly in pieces that did not add up to a person, a red scarf tied too tightly under the chin, cigarette ash tapped into a chipped saucer, the smell of rose hand cream over dish soap, a laugh that came suddenly and disappeared before anyone else could join it. Her father was almost entirely paper. A surname. A birth county. One photograph. Blurred by light. Showing a young man in a short, sleeve shirt standing beside a truck with maple brush stacked high in the bed. Connie had been told he was gone. But gone could mean dead. Moved west. Drinking somewhere. Remarried. Or simply unwilling. Adults used that word when they did not want to supply a map. For a long while, she made a father out of work itself. Work did not promise tenderness, but it did not vanish either. A dish either came clean or it did not. A bed either had hospital corners or it sagged at the sides. A sidewalk either held her weight or gave way to mud. Work had an honest face, and Connie trusted honest things. The only person who ever seemed to belong to her without condition was her mother's father, Père Etienne Bélanger, though even that belonging came in narrow permitted hours. He lived beyond Morrisville, in a weathered white farmhouse with green shutters and a kitchen stove that burned maple blocks so dry they rang when he split them. He was already an aged man when Connie first remembered him clearly. Born in 9-2, with hands so marked by labour that the creases looked dark even after washing. His hair was thin and silver, combed straight back with water. He wore wool trousers in all seasons, suspenders over flannel, and boots he polished not to shine but to preserve. On certain Saturdays, when a foster mother was willing to drive halfway, or when a caseworker had enough mercy left in the week, Connie was brought to him after breakfast and returned before dark. Those were the days she kept in a hidden cabinet of memory. Not bright days. Better than bright. Exact days. Père Etienne did not fill the hours with talk. He gave her a stool near the stove, poured milk into coffee until it was the colour of river stones, and set out bread with butter and maple sugar pressed into the grain. Then he took her the sap house. It sat then on the edge of a sugar bush that had been worked by Bélanger hands since before the Civil War, a squat timber building with a cupola vent, a stone arch, and a brack-ironed evaporator pan that seemed to Connie like the heart of a ship. Even unused, it held a smell that entered the bodily smoke. Iron, damp wood, sweetness, ashes, mice, and spring earth waiting under snow. He showed her how to hold a brace and bit, though she was too young to drill. He let her carry empty sap buckets one at a time, their lids clapping in the March wind. He explained that a sugar maple should not be tapped too low, that a wound in a tree was a serious matter, that you took only what the season gave and never what impatience demanded. He taught her the difference between a spile made by a machine and one drawn out under a hammer, the lip shaped not for beauty but for the way sap gathered itself before falling. On warm afternoons when snow softened around the roots, he would scrape bark gently with his pocket knife and name what he saw. Sapsucker holes, frost crack, old scar, good crown, wind damage. He never spoke to trees as if they were people, yet he treated them with a courtesy most people never offered Connie. Inside the sap house, he placed her hands on tools and told her what they remembered. The draw knife with its handles darkened by 4 generations of palms, the copper finishing pan dented at one corner when his son, André, dropped it at age 12 and then cried from shame until his father made him pancakes in the middle of the day. The iron skimmer, the wool filter, the sugaring off thermometer, the wooden yoke worn smooth where shoulders had carried sap before trucks came up the hill. Anything worth keeping must first be tended, he told her once. Not looking at her, only fitting a lid onto an empty bucket. Connie did not know then whether he meant the tools, the trees, the house, or the child beside him. She only knew he said it with the same care he used when banking coals, leaving enough life under ash for morning. That sentence followed her for years. It returned when she sewed a button onto a borrowed coat, when she cleaned a stranger's kitchen until the sink shone, when she folded a $1 bill in the back of a library book so no one would find it in her drawer. Tending did not look like rescue. It looked like staying with a thing after everyone else had walked away. The last autumn she saw him, he moved more slow from room to room. His breath had begun to catch after the porch steps, and he rested one hand against the door frame before entering the kitchen, as if asking permission from the house itself. Connie was 14. She had grown narrow and watchful. With sleeves too short at the wrists and hair she cut hers because no one had offered. He did not take her to the sugar bush that day. Rain had turned the yard dark, and the air carried the raw smell of leaves beginning to rot. Instead, He opened a cedar chest at the foot of his bed and removed 3 objects wrapped in feed sack. She saw a copper gleam, a folded cloth, and the curved necks of hand-forged spiles before he closed the lid again. Not yet, he said. 2 weeks later, he was gone. The adults the death with tidy voices. There was a funeral Connie attended in shoes borrowed from a girl half a size smaller. There were lilies, a priest, a flag she did not understand, and her mother sitting in the front pew with a handkerchief twisted until it looked like rope. No one asked Connie whether she wanted to stand beside the grave a little longer. No one showed her the cedar chest. No one mentioned the tools. Afterward, things disappeared in the manner of poor families and unrecorded grief. A cousin took the farmhouse contents for storage. A neighbour hauled scrap wood. Papers were placed in envelopes, then mislaid. The sap house, already unused, remained on land whose ownership had tangled itself through tax lines and old boundaries. The sugar bush went quiet. The spiles, the draw knife, the copper pan, all the hand-worn object had seemed too solid to vanish, passed beyond her reach as completely as if they had sunk through ice. Connie went back to placement with a black coat that smelled of mothballs and 1 prayer card in her pocket. Her mother remarried the next year. The man's name was Warren Pike, and he had the kind of politeness that made rooms colder. He worked nights at a warehouse outside Burlington and slept late with the shades drawn, leaving the house under a rule of muffled movement. He was not loud. That was almost worse. Loud men warned you. Warren was deliberate. He adjusted the thermostat by 2 degrees and waited to see who complained. He counted slices of bread. He marked the milk jug with a pencil line. He folded the newspaper into exact quarters and disliked find it changed. When Connie visited on agency-approved weekends, she stayed in the enclosed back porch, where a narrow cot had been placed between a washing machine and stacked boxes of Christmas ornaments. The porch smelled of detergent, dust, and cold rubber. In winter, frost made lacework on the inside of the windows. In summer, flies tapped all night against the screens. Her mother tried, sometimes, in brief and fragile ways. A plate kept warm. A pair of socks bought from a discount bin. Fingers brushing Connie's shoulder when Warren was outside starting the car. But each tenderness arrived like contraband, and Connie learned not to hold it long. The house belonged to Warren's habits. Lucille moved beside them as carefully as everyone else. By 17, Connie was no longer a child the state hoped to place. She was paperwork approaching an ending. Cage chained twice in 1 year. Meetings became shorter. Forms grew more final. There was talk of independent living skills. As if living independently were a recipe one could read from a government pamphlet and prepare without heat. She finished high school early enough to receive a full certificate in a gymnasium that smelled of waxed floor and wet wool. No one came. She walked home in rain, the certificate under her coat, and placed it under the thin mattress of the porch cot because there was no drawer assigned to her. On October 7, 982, she turned 18. That morning, the state gave her a bus ticket, a folder of documents, and the name of a women's shelter that had no beds. Her caseworker, a tired woman with kind eyes and cracked lipstick, pressed 2 quarters into Connie's palm before they parted. It was against some rule, perhaps, but she did it anyway. Connie kept those quarters separate for weeks, not because they were worth much, but because they had been given without being recorded. By late afternoon, She stood outside the house in Burlington where her mother and Warren lived, holding the same plastic grocery bag she had carried between placements. Inside were 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a hairbrush, the prayer card from the funeral, her high school certificate, and a chip mug Pépère Etienne had once used for coffee. The mug was wrapped in a towel so thin the handle showed through. Warren opened the door before she knocked a second time. He wore his warehouse jack and smelled faintly of machine oil. He did not invite her in. Behind him, the hallway light made a yellow stripe across the floorboards. Connie saw her mother at the kitchen table, both hands around a cup. Her face turned not toward the door, but toward the window over the sink. Outside, a maple along the curb begun to lose its leaves. 1 leaf was pasted to wet glass, its veins blackened gold. Warren held out a small card box. It contained mail addressed to Connie, a comb she had left behind, and the certificate she had hidden under the cot. "You can't stay here. Connie. Not even tonight. 8 words can close a house." She took the box because he kept hold it forward. Her mother did not rise. She did not speak. She did not even turn fully away. She remained there in profile, cup between her hands, as if silence was something hot she could drink. Connie waited 1 careful breath longer than pride allowed. Then she slipped the box in the grocery bag, tucked the mug deeper under the towel, and stepped back from the threshold. Warren closed the door without force. The latch clicked in ordinary way. That was the part she remembered. Not a slam. Not a scene. Just the exact small sound of a place deciding she was outside it. For 6 weeks. She lived in spaces meant for passing through. The first nights were in Burlington, under the east side of a loading dock where the wind came off Lake Champlain and carried the smell of diesel, wet cardboard, and early snow. She slept sitting up with her bag looped twice around her wrist. At dawn, trucks arrived, and she walked before anyone could tell her to move. She washed in public restrooms, drank from library fountains, and learned which diners would let a girl sit with 1 coffee until the lunch crowd came. Her money diminished by cents and necessities. A roll bought at closing. A laundromat dryer paid for not to dry clothes but to warm her hand beside the vent. 1 bus ride to Winooski when a shelter worker said there might be a church basement open. There was not. By the end of the first week, she had $14.09, counting the 2 quarters she still kept apart. In Montpelier, she slept one night in the doorway of an insurance office, beneath the sign promised security to people with policies. The irony did not amuse her. Nothing did. The stone steps held the day's cold and gave it back through her coat. She woke with her right hand numb around the grocery bag handle and spent 20 minutes flexing each finger until the pins of feeling returned. In Bar, she found a soup kitchen behind a parish hall where a woman named Mrs. Leahy gave her stew with asking for a story. That kindness was so clean Connie almost could not swallow. She ate slowly, wiping the spoon against the bowl until there was no broth left. Mrs. Leahy placed a heel of bread beside her hand and said only, "For later." Connie carried it in her coat pocket until dark, taking bites no larger than a thumbprint. She avoided the places where girls disappeared into cars. She avoided men who offered rides too quickly. She slept once in a bus station until a policeman told her she needed a ticket, then spent $1.10 on the cheapest fare east just to remain indoors until morning. The bus took her to St. Johnsbury through hills already hardening toward winter. She watched Dark Farm slide past the window. Every lit kitchen a room in a life she could not enter. By the 4th week, She knew how to read towns by their benches. A bench near a courthouse meant patrols. A bench near a laundromat meant warmth but question. A bench beside a cemetery meant quiet, though the ground wind came sharp through the iron fence. She slept in a cemetery shed one rain-heavy night out Waterbury, curled between a stack of plastic flower cones and a coil of hose, listening to drops strike the tin roof in uneven measure. She did not cry where anyone could see. Her body had become practical. It asked for heat, food, sleep, dry socks. Grief was too large and useless to carry openly, so she packed it beneath action. Walk. Count coins. Keep the mug wrapped. Find a wall out of wind. Rise before being found. On the 39th day, she had $4.86, plus the 2 quarters. On the 42nd day, she entered the public library in Morrisville because snow had begun without ceremony, fine and dry, crossing the street in a slant. The library was housed in a brick building with tall windows and radiators that knocked softly inside their covers. The air smelled of paste, wool coats, and paper warmed by winter light. Connie removed her hat and stood near the entrance until the circulation librarian looked up, then looked back down. Permission enough. She had come for warmth, but warmth led to sitting, and sitting led to reading whatever lay within reach. On a long oak table near the periodicals, someone had left the county notices folded beside the classifieds. The pages were damp at one corner from melted snow. Connie smoothed them with her palm and read 'cause reading cost nothing. There were advertisements for cordwood, used tires, a dairy cow with one blind eye, a wood stove missing 2 lids, a church rummage sale, and 3 notices of tax-delinquent properties scheduled for disposal. She read past them once. Then she returned. The 3rd notice was only 6 lines. Lamoille County, abandoned agricultural outbuilding, former maple sugaring sap house, Hyde Park vicinity, structure unsafe, no utilities, no surveyed road frontage, quick claim transfer for $1 upon assumption of liability, pending spring 9983. The word maple did not warm her exactly. It struck. She read the notice again, then again more slowly, until every line sat in her mind with the weight of an object placed on a table. Former maple sugaring sap house, Hyde Park vicinity, $1, assumption of liability, undafe, demolition pending. The radio knocked once, then settled. Connie placed both hands flat on the newspaper so they would stop moving. Around her, the library continued in its patient way. A man turned a page. A child coughed near the picture books. Snow tapped the windows with dry fingertips. No one in that room knew that a door had opened. Not a friendly door, not a safe one, but a door still standing where before there had been only weather. She asked the librarian for the telephone book and copied the county office address on the back of an envelope already used for something else. Her handwriting looked older than she felt. Then she counted her money under the table, shielding the coins with her coat sleeve. $4.86. 2 quarters set apart. 1 possible dollar for the building. There remained the question of reaching it. The next morning, Connie bought a day-old biscuit from a bakery in Morrisville and saved half for later. She spent nothing on coffee. She walked to the edge of town where Route 15 bent toward Hyde Park, her bag in one hand, the card box tied with string under her arm, the chipped mug wrapped more carefully than anything else she owned. The sky was dull white of unpolished tin. A farm truck passed. then a school bus, then a sedan with salt whitening its lower door. She had no appointment. She had no guarantee the notice was still valid. She had no proper coat for the hills, no boots for the ditches, no one expecting her at the other end. Still, she began walking, past the last gas station, past a field where crows stood brack against stubble, past a mailbox leaning under the weight of old snow. Connie followed the road toward the county office and toward a building everyone else had already surrendered to weather, taxes, and forgetting. By dusk, the sap house was still only a notice fold in her pocket, but for the first time since the door in Burlington closed, the road ahead did not feel like escape. It felt like return. The Bess left her at the edge of Hyde Park just after noon, beside a ploughed bank hardened by exhaust and thaw. It was not a station so much as a widened place in the road, with a bench half buried under wind, scatter snow, and a posted schedule sealed bind scratched plastic. The driver opened the door with a sigh of hydraulics, waited until she had stepped down with her bag and box, then pulled away toward Johnson, leaving a brief brown cloud of road salt behind him. Connie stood still until the sound of the engine folded into hills. The cold was not dramatic. It was simply complete. 22 degrees by the bank clock she had passed in Morrisville, and falling, with a northwest wind that came across the open fields and found every seam in her coat. She had slept the night before in the far end of Hay Barn outside Morristown, where bales were stacked higher than a church organ, and the air carried the dusty sweetness of dried grass, mouse droppings, and old summer. The farmer had not known she was there. Or if he had known, he had been kind enough to let ignorance do the work of mercy. She had walked close to 7 miles that morning before catching the bus for the last stretch, keeping to the shoulder whenever trucks came by, and stepping into the ditch when the snowbanks forced her there. Twice she stopped to pull ice from the hems of her jeans. Once she stood under a roadside maple, pressing her hands beneath her arms until feeling returned in sharp little needles. By the time she reached Hyde Park proper, her toes had gone from matching to wooden. The village looked as if it had been placed carefully into the hills and then left there for weather to educate. A white church stood with its steeple pointing in the pewter sky. The county courthouse rose square and pale, its windows tall and severe. There was a general store with a bell over the door and sacks of feed stacked under the awning. A pharmacy with green lettering and a rotating rack of postcards visible through the glass. A cafe whose front window steamed from soup and percolated coffee. A barber shop with a striped pole that turned too slowly. And a hardware store with snow shovels leaned in a deliberate row beside the entrance. Across from the courthouse, a narrow bank kept its blinds half lowered. Beside it, a real estate office displayed photographs of farmhouses Connie could not imagine entering. Near the corner, a laundromat breathed warm lint through a vent into the alley, and she paused there long enough to warm one hand at a time without making hers too visible. The county clerk's office was in a brick building that had seen more winters than paint. Its steps were clear down the centre, leaving snowpack along both rails, and the brass handle on the door held the kind of cold that bit before skin could withdraw. Inside, heat gathered unevenly near the ceiling, while the floor kept a cellar chill. The hallway smelled of wet wool, floor wax, carbon paper, and the dry mineral dust of old records. She removed her hat. That seemed proper. A wooden sign pointed left for land records, licenses, and tax maps. Connie followed it past framed photographs of men in dark suits whose names were printed on brass plates. Their faces had the solemn look of people trusted to keep boundaries straight. At the end of the hall, a frosted glass door stood open, and beyond it came the steady clack of typewriter keys. The woman behind the counter did not look up at once. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with iron grey hair pinned into coil at the back of her head and a narrow face made narrower by wire, rimmed glasses. She wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse, and at her throat was a small silver pin shaped like a pine cone. On the counter in front of her sat a nameplate, brack with gold letters. A. Delane Porter, Count Clerk. Her desk was orderly in a way that made disorder feel like a moral failing. Rubber stamps lined up by size. A brass date rest square of green felt stood in 2 metal trays. A glass paperweight held down a stack of forms, and inside the glass was a tiny air bubble that looked trapped there permanently. Connie waited. Mrs. Porter finished typing one line, pulled the carriage back with a clean metallic ring, and then raised her eyes. Yes? The word was not unkind. It was not welcome either. Connie unfolded the classified notice with fingers that left damp marks on the paper. I came about this. Mrs. Porter took the clipping. Read it. And looked at Connie again. This time not at her face first, but at the coat, the plastic bag, the card box, and the shoes stained white at the edges from road salt. Her expression did not change. That was a mercy of its own. The sap house. Yes. Ma'am. You undone, that is not a resident. Yes. Ma'am. It has no plumbing. Yes. Ma'am. No electric. Yes. Ma'am. The road is not maintained in winter. Yes. Ma'am. The roof is compromised. The chimney is unsafe, and the north wall has moved out of true. The county takes no responsibility for injury, loss, fire, weather damage, animal damage, or any expense arising from your entry on the property. Yes. Ma'am. Mrs. Porter removed her glass and set them on the blotter. Without them, her eyes looked less official and more tired. You also understand that quitclaim means exactly what it says. The county is not promising good title beyond its authority to transfer what it holds. There may be old easements, old survey mistakes, and old disappointments. Connie held her still. Yes. Ma'am. The clerk studied her for another breath. Do you have someone advising you? No. Ma'am. Someone to help repair it? No. Ma'am. Somewhere else to sleep while you determine whether it is safe? Connie looked toward the window, where a crow moved along the courthouse roofline with careful brack step. No. Ma'am. Mrs. Porter put her glasses back on. The typewriter sat between them like a witness. Well, she said at last. Then I will read slowly. She took a folder from the second metal tray and opened it with both hands. The papers inside were thin and yellow at the edges. Some typed, some copied, some marked with pencil notations in margins where previous clerks had tried to make sense of previous neglect. There was a tax map with a lot shaded in faded pink. There was a liability release. There was an assumption of maintenance. There was a note authorizing demolition after the spring thaw if no transfer occurred. Mrs. Porter read each paragraph aloud, not because Connie seemed unable to read, but because the words thems deserved to be heard before they became binding. Unsafe structure. No warranty. No municipal services. Access by old farm track from the town road. Purchaser assumes all responsibility. Purchaser acknowledges condition. Connie signed where the clerk placed her finger. Her signature looked small on the line. Constance M. Bélanger. The ink darkened briefly, then settled in the paper as if it had always meant to be there. When the last form was signed, Mrs. Porter opened a drawer and removed a flat metal cash box. Connie found a bill from the envelope in her pocket. It had been creased into quarters, then eighths, then smoothed again so many times that the paper felt soft as cloth. She laid it on the counter. The clerk accepted it with formal care. Then came the brass stamp. Mrs. Porter lifted it from the felt square, adjusted the paper beneath, and brought the handle down. The sound was heavier than Connie expected. Not loud, but final. A round seal peered in the corner, raised and exact, catching light along its edges. The clerk repeated the action twice more. Each impression pressing the sap house a little farther out of abandonment and into record. She wrote a receipt by hand. 1 copy for you, she said. 1 retained here. Connie took the folded deed, the receipt, and a rough map drawn on county stationery. The map showed Route 15, a turn towards Centerville Road, then a smaller way marked only as old sugaring track. Mrs. Porter drew an X where the building stood and a dot line where Connie would likely lose the road beneath snow. You will follow the town road east until the second stone culvert, the clerk said. Not the first. The first leads toward the Sawyer place. At the second, there is a stand of walnut trees on the right and a barb gate that may be down. The track climbs north. If you read barn with a tin star, you have gone too far. Connie nodded. Do not go by twilight unless you must. Connie folded the map carefully. Mrs. Porter's hand remained on the edge of the folder. She gone still in a way Connie recognized from rooms where something unplanned had entered. Bélanger, the clerk said. Connie lifted her eyes. That is your name. Yes. Ma'am. There was an Etienne Bélanger in that part of the county. The office seemed to narrow round the sound. Mrs. Porter looked not at Connie now, but at some place just beyond her. Perhaps 30 years behind the counter. Perhaps farther. He came in when I was a junior assistant. Brought land tax payments in exact chain. Always smelled faintly of smoke. Even in July. He had a son, I believe. André. Connie closed one hand around the deed. The clerk glanced toward the frosted glass door, then lowered her voice a fraction. Sap House may have been his. Once. Or his family's. The records are tangled. They often are. With hill land. Connie did not answer. Mrs. Porter saw something in her silence and did not press. Instead, she reached for a small envelope from the drawer where she kept carbon sheets, slid the receipt and deed into it, and wrote the property notation on the front in neat block letters. Then she hesitated, opened the cash box again, and looked at the folded dollar lying among coins and municipal payments. For a moment, Connie thought she might return it. She did not. She placed it beneath paper tray in the cash box, separate from the rest, as though even official money could require a kind of witness. You want the hardware store before you go, Mrs. Porter said. Match, at least. A lantern, if Mr. Whitcomb has one used. I have a candle. The clerk's mouth tightened. Not in judgment exactly, but in arithmetic. Candle. Abandoned building. Unsafe chimney. Winter road. Girl alone. Then matches, she said. Outside, the afternoon had lowered itself in that blue-grey hour when winter light seems undecided. Connie stood on the steps of the clerk's office with the envelope tucked inside her coat, feeling its corners against her ribs. People passed without looking. A man carried a sack of feed over one shoulder. A woman came out of the pharmacy holding a paper bag to her chest. From the cafe came the smell of onions softening in butter. She went first to the general store because the hardware store clerk was helping someone load stovepipe into a truck. The bell over the general store door gave a thin ring, and 3 people looked up, then looked back down in the polite Vermont manner that notices everything and claims nothing. She bought matches, 2 apples bruised enough to be cheaper, and a heel of cheddar wrapped in wax paper. The woman at the register changed into Connie's palm and added 1 extra matchbook without comment. At the hardware store, she stood among bins of nails, coils of rope, kerosene cans, axe handles, stove gaskets, lamp wicks, mouse traps, snow shovels, and blue enamel coffee pots. The place smelled of oiled wood, metal filings, turpentine, and seed packet waiting for a season months away. Behind the counter, a man with white eyebrows and a red plaid shirt was measuring glass for another customer, so Connie only touched the price tag on a used lantern, read the number, and removed her hand. Too much. She bought 1 short length of cotton twine, a box of kitchen matches better than the free ones, and a tin cup with a dent that made it cheaper. The owner looked at her envelope, then at her face, then at the twine. "Cold walk," he said. "Yes, sir." He placed a pencil by his ear. "Roads pour past the culvert." "Yes, sir." He rang up the matches and cup, then leaned below the counter and came back with a stub of tallow candle wrapped in newspaper. "N broke off," he said. "Cannot sell it." Connie understood the kindness in the lie and accepted it as carefully as bread. By then the sky had begun to gather herself for evening. She followed Mrs. Porter's directions out of the village, past the courthouse, past the neat houses with storm windows and smoke rising straight from the chimneys, past the red barn with hay wagons drawn close to the wall. A dog came down a drive barking with more duty than anger, stopped at the edge of its property, and watched her pass. On a porch, an older man in a wool cap lifted 2 fingers from the rail. Connie returned the gesture. The town road narrowed after the first mile. Snow lay in the ditches with the blue shadows of early dusk gathered in its hollows. She passed a mailbox painted with faded green vines, a collapsed stone wall, and a field where black-faced sheep stood close to a feeder. The first culvert was easy to see because water moved under it with a hollow sound. She did not turn there. The second culvert almost escaped her. It was lower, half covered by drifted snow, Mark II stones set upright at the ditch edge. Beyond it stood the walnuts, Mrs. Porter had mentioned, leafless and wide-limbed, their bark ridged like the hands of patient workers. The wire gate was indeed down, 1 post leaning, the wire buried under snow except where it caught a little dull light. Connie stepped over carefully. The track climbed north. It was not a road so much as a remembered passage between trees. Saplings had leaned in from both sides. Frozen grass broke through the snow in stiff yellow blades. There were old ruts underfoot, hardened now, and if she stepped wrong, her ankle turned against their edges. She carried the box against her hip and shifted the bag from one hand to the other until both hands ached equally. After a quarter mile, the village was gone behind her. No courthouse. No cafe window. No bell above a store door. Only the track, the trees, the sound of her own breathing, and the faint knock of something loose inside the cardboard box. Then the land opened. The sap house stood at the far edge of small clearing, back to sugar maples and a steep rise of darker. At first, it seemed less built tan gathered from the materials around it. Fieldstone foundation, red-hewn timbers, rough clapboard silvered by years of weather, and a roof of rusted tin patched in 2 places with mismatched sheet. The building was modest, perhaps 4 feet long and 16 feet wide, with a long side facing south and the rear pressed close to the slope. A cupola vent straddled the roof ridge like a narrow watchman. 1 brick chimney rose from the western end, missing mortar at the crown. A sliding door hung slight out of square-on iron hardware, and beside it, nailed above eye level, was a board sign so faded that only certain letters remained. Bélanger Cigar Works. The paint had nearly gone. The name had not. Connie stopped at the edge of the clearing and let the sight reach her without hurrying it. Snow lay against the foundation stones. A fallen branch rested across the threshold. The north wall leaned outward just as the notice had warned. Not enough to have fallen. Enough to prove it had been resisting gravity for a long while. Under the eaves, old swallow nests clung like dried clay. The windows were small, 6 panes each, though several panes had been replaced by carved gone soft from damp. The door bore scratches near the bottom where animals had tried their own forms of entry. There was no welcome except endurance. She crossed the clearing. The sliding door resisted at first, frozen at the track. She set down the box, dug snow from the sill with a tin cup, then pulled again. The rollers complained in a dry metal voice. The door moved 4 inches, then 8, then enough for her to slip through sideways. The smell came first. Cold ash, old smoke, pine pitch, mouse nest, wet boards, maple sweetness so faint it might have been memory rather than scent. Under it all lay the mineral damp of stone and the iron note of rust. She stood just inside until her eyes adjusted to dimness. The front room held the evaporator, it on a stone arch brackened by decades of firing, iron pan broad and shallow, divided into channels where sap once moved slowly towards syrup under the eye of someone who knew how to read steam. The pan had rust along the seams but had not collapsed. Beside it stood a stack of split wood gone punky at the ends, an iron rake, 2 dented buckets, and a shelf with jars clouded by dust. Above, cupola vent lost 1 slat, and a pale blade of sky showed through. The floorboards creaked under her weight but did not give. She tested each step before trusting it. In the back room, the air was closer. It had likely served for storage and sugaring off, with a workbench along one wall and hooks overhead where equipment had once hung. A table leaned with one leg shortened by rot. A flour sack, empty and stiff, lay in the corner. There was a narrow loft above, reached by a ladder missing its lowest rung. The smell of mice was stronger there, and from inside the well came a faint ticking, either ice loosening or some small creature objecting to her arrival. She found a broom with half its straw gone and swept a place near the interior wall, away from the worst of the draughts. Dust rose and glittered in the slanting light. She swept slowly, not to clean the room, which would take more than 1 evening, but to make a claim no wider than her body. Then she walked back outside for fallen branches. By the time she returned with an armload, twilight had entered the building and settled in the corners. She did not trust the chimney. Mrs. Porter's warning held. So she made no fire in the ark, only cleared a shallow metal pan of debris and set the broken tallow candle inside it. The match flared sulphurous and sudden, lighting her hands, the edge of the stonework, the lower curve of the evaporator pan. Then the flame steadied. The candle gave almost no heat. It gave shape. She ate half an apple, a little cheese, and the biscuit saved from morning. She drank water from the tin cup after melting snow against the cup with her palms for as long as she could bear it. Then deciding cold water was better than waiting. Every sound sight arrived enlarged. Wind rubbing the tin roof, a branch striking the rear wall, snow settling off a limb. Far away, perhaps from a farm, the low note of a dog answering another dog. Inside, the sap house responded with its own vocabulary. Boards shifting, metal contracting, a soft slide of dust from somewhere overhead. The faint hollow knock of the loose door when the wind found it. Connie unwrapped the chipped mug and placed it on the floor beside her candle. In that building, the mug did not look poor. It looked returned. She made her bed from what she had. The towel folded under her hip. The card box emptied and flat beneath her shoulders. Her coat buttoned all the way up. The plastic bag tied and tucked under head with the documents inside the inner pocket of her shirt. She kept her shoes on. She kept the candle within reach until it burned too low, then pinched it out between wetted fingers and let the dark take back the room. At first, the darkness was absolute. Then she learned it was not. Snow outside reflected a little light through the broken panes. The cupola held a grey seam against the roof. The evaporator pan gathered what light there was along one rim. A dull, patient line. The building did not comfort her in any easy way. It did not promise safety. It did not become home because a paper said so. It only stood around her with its weathered timbers and cold iron, asking nothing more than that she remain until morning. For the first time in many weeks, no one ordered her away. That was enough. She lay on the floor of the back room with one hand against the boards, feeling the cold rise through pine and bone, and listened until the sounds arranged them into something less like threat and more like company. Some sap houses are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. Morning entered through the broken panes as a grey dilution of darkness, and Connie woke before she understood where her body had spent the night. Her cheek rested against her bundled coat sleeve. One shoulder had gone stiff against the flattened cardboard. Her knees ached from being drawn up too tightly, and when she sat, the cold moved through her as if the floor had lent it permission. For a moment she remained with both hands on the boards, listening to the building set around first light. Nothing had fallen. That was the first fact. She stood slowly, testing the room as one tests ice, by distributing trust in careful increments. The floor creaked under her left heel near the workbench, moaned near the doorway, and gave a hollow warning beside the south wall. By noon of that first day, she knew which boards would carry her quietly and which must be crossed with weight held toward the joists. The sap house had a map underfoot, and she began learn it the way she had once learned the moods of foster kitchens. Outside, the clearing looked less strange in daylight. Snow had crusted along the old ruts, and the sugar maples rose behind the building with their bare branches locked against the pale sky. She found the well 20 yards downslope, marked by a low stone curb and 2 boards laid across it, both bowed with age. She did not trust the boards. She lay flat on the frozen ground and lifted one with both hands until she could peer in the dark below. A smell up cold and mineral, with no rot in it. She dropped a pebble. It struck water after a long silence. That sound steadied her more than any promise could have done. Water meant labour, but it also meant remaining. She tied her cotton twine to the handle of a rusted sap bucket she found under the eaves, lowered it until it tipped, and drew up half a pail of water clouded with flecks of leaf and iron. She let it settle. Then she poured from the top into her tin cup and boiled nothing, because there was no safe fire yet. She drank anyway. The outhouse stood beyond a line of sumac, leaning backward as if offended by its own continued existence. One hinge had pulled loose. The seat was cold enough to make her breath catch. A porcupine had chewed the lower corner, and the Sears catalogue nailed to a beam had gone brittle and grey. She cleared snow from the threshold with a broken board and made her use it before dark, because fear grows fatter when fed by postponement. The second day she swept. Not properly. Not clean. Only enough to learn what was beneath dust and nest, beneath wind-blown leaves and squirrel husks and the fine black powder that seemed to sift from every beam. She swept the front room into little piles and carried them outside on a square of cardboard. Acorns. Chewed bark. Dead flies. Mouse droppings. A rusted nail bent like a question. 3 maple leaves so dry they kept their shape until her breath touched them. The third day she made an inventory of danger. Roof seam above front corner. Chimney crown broken. North wallow. Backroom floor soft near south sill. Ladder unsafe. Door runner rusted. Window card rotten. Unknown animal access. No fire until chimney inspection. No climb until ladder repaired. No sleeping under cupola during wind. She wrote the list on the back of old county envelope with a pence stub misses. Porter had left beside the receipt. Her handwriting shook less than it had on the deed. By then, the building had begun to teach her its hours. At dawn, the tin roof clicked as frost loosened. At mid-morning, meltwater found the same seam and dropped into the same dented bucket, one patient tap at a time. At afternoon, the western will warmed just enough to release the smell of old smoke from the chinking. After sundown, the whole structure tightened around itself. She knew the floor's creaks by their character. The board beside the evaporator gave a short crack like a knuckle. The one near the back room door sighed. The plank under the shelf made no sound at all if she stepped near the nail heads. Each sound became less alarming once named. A life could be built from that. Perhaps. Name what frightens you. Learn where it lives. Step differently. On the 4th morning, hunger sent her back toward town. She left early, while the snow was still firm enough to hold her weight over the ruts, and carried the deed envelope inside her coat as if it were both shield and accusation. The walk down to road took longer than she expected. The track that had climbed in ducks seemed steeper by light, and twice she slipped on hidden ice, catching hers against saplings whose bark dark stripes on her palms. Hyde Park looked awake by the time she reached. Smoke rose from chimneys. The cafe window was fog nearly white. A delivery truck idled out to the pharmacy. Someone had shoveled the hardware store steps and scattered sand in a fan across the walk. She entered because she needed more than matches now. The bell over the door rang once. Modestly. Inside, the heat smelled of coal dust, oiled floors, rubber boots, and coffee kept too long on a back-room burner. The aisles were narrow and practical. Wooden bins held carriage bolts, washers, roofing nails, common nails, finishing nails, stove bolts, hinges, hooks, brads, and screw sorted by hand-lettered labels. Glass jars of lamp chimneys lined a high shelf. Coils of sash cord hung from a peg like pale rope bracelet. Snow shovels stood in a blue barrel near the door. The man behind the counter was the same one who had given her the broken candle. In daylight he seemed larger and more precise. Broad across the shoulders, with a white moustache-trimmed devil and eyebrows that made his eyes appear deeper set. He wore a red-plaid shirt beneath a canvas apron darkened by years of varnish, kerosene, and weather. His hands were square, with a half-moon scar across the back of the right one. He was sharpening a chisel on a stone. Not for sale, perhaps. Only because a dull edge bothered him. He looked up. You found the place. Yes. Sir. Still standing. Yes. Sir. That counts for something. She placed her pencil list on the counter. He read without touching it. Then he looked at her shoes, her coat, the raw place on one knuckle, and the deed envelope just visible where the coat opened. You planning to burn in that art? Not until I clean the chimney. Good. I do not know how. He set the chisel down. Most people, when told of ignorance, moved either toward contempt or performance. Mr. Whitcomb did neither. He turned to a shelf behind him, pulled down a thin booklet with a torn green cover, and laid it on the counter. Home Repair for Farm Outbuilding. Revised edition. None 968. The cover showed a man in a cap holding a hammer under a roofline too neat to be believable. Read the chimney section twice, he said. Then read it again. How much? For the... Yes. Sir. Free if you bring it back dry. Connie placed her fingers lightly on the cover. I can do that. He took her list and began adding items in his own blunt handwriting. Wire brush. 6-inch if the flu takes it. I will lend. Not sell. Rope. 20 feet. Drop cloth, though an old feed sack will serve. Cold chisel. You can borrow that too. Dust mask. 2 of those. Stove cement. Small tub, if the timble gap is open. Work gloves. Yours are gone. I can't buy all of that. I heard you. The store seemed to come quieter. Outside. Tires hissed through slush. He leaned one elbow on the counter. I keep counts for farmers, widows, and fools with roofs. Which are you? Connie did not smile, though the question allowed for it. I do not know yet. That may be the most honest answer I hear today. He turned an account card around and wrote Bélanger, C.M. At the top. He did not ask for references. He did not ask whether she was good for it. He wrote as if credit were a tool, dangerous if mishandled, useful if respected. You buy only what keeps you warm, dry, and alive, he said. No paint, no curtains, no prettifying rot. Yes. Sir. You pay when you can. Yes. Sir. And you not set that place on fire learning price. No. Sir. He nodded, satisfied enough for the morning. From the bins and shelves came her first true supply list, 1 pair of split cowhide work gloves, in regular stitching, 1 cent, 1 dust mask, 22 cents, with a second placed beside it and not written down, 10 feet of half-inch manila rope, 1 small tin of stove cement, 9 cents, 6 common nails from an open bin, 12 cents total, 1 packet of safety matches, 9 cents, one used putty knife with the handle cracked. 15 cents, one tin-all marked down the can was dented. 48 cents, one borrowed wire chimney brush. 6 round, one borrowed cold chisel, one borrowed flat fie, one loaned canvassed feed sack fold under the arm. Mr. Whitcomb wrote the prices in a ledger, then in pencil on her account card. The total came to $4.04 purchased, with tools signed out beneath. Connie read the number twice. I have $2 today. Then pay $2 today. She took the coins from her pocket slowly, separating the quarters she still did not spend. The remaining change looked small on his counter. Mr. Whitcomb swept it into his palm without counting aloud. That was another kindness. Before she left, he stopped her with one finger raised. Do you know creosote? No. Sir. Black glaze in the flue. Burns hot when it catches. Hot enough to crack brick. Hot enough to make a chimney sound like a train. You scrape until loose soot stops falling. Then you scrape again. Yes, sir. And cover your face. It tastes like old sin. By the time she reached the sap house, the sky had begun to cloud over. She was sweating under her coat despite the cold, from carrying oil, rope, cement, borrowed tools, and the weight of being trusted in a ledger. She set everything on the front room shelf and rested until her breathing steadied. Then she read the chimney chapter. She read it sitting on the floor with the manual laid on her knees, lips moving slight over phrase that needed to come muscle. Inspect firebox, examine flue, remove loose debris, brush from tiff roof access is safe, brush from bottom if not, protect eyes and lungs, check with small smoke source, repair gaps before use. She read the diagrams until she could picture the flue as a dark throat rising from the arch through brick and roof. She read the warning box 3 times. She did not climb the roof. The tin was slick, the ladder untrustworthy, and there was no one below to hear her fall. Instead, she worked from the bottom. First, she cleared the stone arch of nest, bark, old ash, and a scatter of annel bones small enough to fit in a cupped hand. She laid the feed sack over the evaporator pan and weighted the corners with stones, not yet noticing anything strange beneath it, only protecting the iron from the worst of the soot. She tied the borrowed brush to the rope, then tied the other end around her wrist, because losing it inside the flue would finish the work before it began. The first push upward met resistance almost immediately. She pulled down. Soot fell in a dry whisper. Again. This time brack flakes came with it, brittle as burned leaves. She turned her face away too late and tasted bitterness through the mask. Mr. Whitcomb had been right. Old sin. For 6 hours. Broken by cold and numb fingers. Connie cleaned the chimney. She pushed the brush upward as far as her reach and the rope allowed. Twisted. Pulled. Knocked loose what she could. Then gathered the fall with the putty knife and carried it outside in the tin cup. The creosote came in layers. Fine powder first. Then flakes. Then a glazed chunk the size of a thumb that struck the stone arch with a hard click. Each time she thought the flue was clear. She looked up and saw another ledge of brackness clinging where fire had once breathed. She worked until her shoulders trembled. At mid-afternoon, she'd dug the timber gap where mortar had fallen away behind the arch, leaving a crescent through which smoke could have entered the room. She cleaned the edges with the cold chisel, dampened the brick with a rag of melted snow, and pressed stove cement into the opening with the cracked putty knife. The smelled sharp and mineral. It smeared under her fingers and stiffened quickly in the cold. Her repair was not pretty. It was honest. She waited. The manual said longer would be better. The weather said night was coming. Connie compromised with caution. Near dusk, she lit a twist of newspaper, held it near the arch opening, and watched the smoke. It hesitated. Then it drew upward. She closed her eyes for one breath. Not in prayer exactly, but because the body some recognizes deliverance before the mind permits it. The first fire was no larger than a shoebox. She built it from dry splinters shaved off the interior of punky logs, 3 twigs from beneath the eaves, and 1 curl of paper torn from an advertisement in the county notices. The match flared. The paper caught. The splinters brackened, then gave a narrow orange line. Smoke crawled sideways for a second, then lifted in the chimney and vanished. Connie crouched there, both hands near the little flame, watching as if watching a child breathe. No roar, no chimney fire, no room filling with smoke, no collapse, only flame. She fed it slowly, twig by twig, then with 1 split piece of old maple no wider than her wrist. The wood took reluctantly, hissing where damp remained at its core, then settled into steady burn. Heat gathered first at the stone, then along her palms, then at her face. It did not warm the whole room. It did not need to. It made a centre. For her first hot meal, she set the tin cup near the coals with water, a shaving of cheddar, and bits of biscuit broken into it. It was not soup in any proud sense. It was melted, salted, smoky water with bread softened enough to eat slow. She held the cup in both hands and drank from the edge once it cooled. The taste was ash and tin, and nothing in her life had ever seemed more carefully earned. That night, she slept close to the arch, not too close, with one eye opening whenever the fire settled. Before lying down, she banked the coals under ash the way Pépère Etienne had once shown her on a stove older than this one. Luff for morning, he had said without saying it. Enough patience under cover. The next day became work a different kind, now that the cold had been given answer, however modest. Connie turned to the workroom. She began at the door and moved clockwise, writing what she found. The act itself steadied her, item by item, shelf by shelf. No mysteries until all ordinary things had been given their names. On the first shelf 3 glass jars, empty, mouse-chewed paper labels, 1 rusted awl, 2 tin funnels with solder seam split, a lump of hardened beeswax, a wooden mallet cracked through the head, 4 square nails in a tobacco tin, a roll of wire so brittle it snapped when bent, 1 blue bottle with a cork too dry to remove, 1 sap bucket lid, 1 length of chain, 1 yoke peg, 1 iron hook shaped for lifting something heavy, 1 leather strap eaten nearly through, 1 empty place darker than the boards around it, where some larger tool had hung for years and been taken down or hidden. A broken chair rung, a burlap sack full of mouse nests, a stovepipe elbow, 6 clay shards from something once whole, a pair of gloves so stiff they held the shape of absent hands. In the back corner, a crate stamped with apples from a farm in Franklin County inside it. Straw, a cracked wash basin, 2 syrup tins flattened and rusted, a child's marble green as bottle glass, and a folded issue of the Burlington Free Press dated March 9953. She unfolded the newspaper and read a headline about snowmelt flooding roads in the Winooski Valley. The paper left grey on her fingertips. She folded again and set it aside, not because it was useful, but because someone had once kept it for a reason. The loft yielded little. She tested the ladder, then repaired the missing rung with a board and 2 borrowed nails before trusting her weight. Even then, she climbed as if footstep required permission. Above, the air was warmer and heavier with dust. There were bundles of old lath, a wasp nest empty as paper, several roof shingles, a coil of rope gone soft with rot, and a wooden sign on both sides, boiling today. The letters were red under dust. She brought the sign down and leaned it against the well. By late afternoon, her inventory had covered both sides of the envelope. Still, something in the front room would not settle. It began as a sound. She had swept around the evaporator again, clearing soot that had fallen during chimney work. The feed sack still lay over part of the pan, and when she shifted one of the waiting stones, it slipped from her hand and struck the floor beside the stone arch. The sound should have been solid. It was not. It gave a low, contained hollow note, muted but unmistakable, like a knock from under ice. Connie froze. Then she picked up the stone and struck another place on the floor. Solid. She struck near the woodpile. Solid. She struck beside the arch again. Hollow. The place lay not beneath the floorboard, but under the front lip of the evaporator setting, where the stonework met a packed-earthen apron blackened by years of ash. It was a bad place for curiosity. Heavy iron above. Stone arch beside it. Unknown structure below. Her first thought was not treasure. It was collapse. She tested with the handle of the broom. Tap. 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 The hollow area was roughly round, perhaps 2 feet across, centered beneath the forward edge of the pan where a person tending the boil would have stood. The packed earth there had a darker sheen than the surrounding floor. At first she thought it was only grease, old syrup, or ash sealed into damp soil. Then the potty knife caught at a curved seam. Not stone. Not earth. Wood. She knelt and brushed the surface with her gloved hand. Ash lifted in a grey veil. Beneath it, fitted nearly flush with the packed floor, was a cedar disc, wide as a barrel head and darkened almost black. Its edges had been sealed with something glossy and hard. Pine tar. She knew the smell once the knife disturbed it. Sharp, resinous, and old. Her pulse became difficult to ignore. She did not open it at once. Instead, she cleared the whole perimeter, slowly, with the putty knife, loosening tar no more than a shaving at a time. The disc had no handle, no ring, no visible hinge, only a small notch at one edge, filled with tar and soot. She pressed the knife in the notch and found resistance beneath, as if the lid had been wedged down from above and meant not to be found by accident. The sensible action was to stop. The sensible action was to miss Whitcomb to come look. But evening had begun to blue the windows, and the building had given her the sound itself. Connie did what she had done all her life when presented with a closed thing that held part of her future. She worked carefully until open. The pine tar softened slightly when warmed. She learned this by accident after placing a coal shovel too close. So she built a controlled fire, no larger than the first, heated the putty knife, and pressed the warm blade along the seam. The tar gave off a smell like summer boards in direct sun. Bit by bit, the seal loosened. She pried, then stopped, heated again, pried again, listened for cracking wood, felt for movement. It took nearly 2 hours. At last, the cedar disc lifted a fraction. Cold air came from below, carrying the smell of stone, clay, and something sweet so old it seemed impossible. Connie slipped both hands under the edge and raised the lid. Beneath was a pit lined with flat stone, no deeper than her forearm, its walls built with the same deliberate care as the sap house foundation. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and birch bark and sealed clay, were packages arranged not as refuse but as a person arranges memory when expecting absence to belong. She sat back on her heels. The room had gone almost dark. The little fire moved against the stones, and light entered the pit in fragments. She did not reach down until she had lit the tallow candle. First came the tools. A bundle of oilcloth tied with linen cord lay across the top. The knots had stiffened but not rotted. Connie worked them loose with the awl from the shelf, picking fibre apart rather than cutting. Inside was a complete of hand-forged sugaring spile, each wrapped in waxed paper, their narrow throats blackened with age but not rusted through. There were 40 of them, maybe more, made not by factory stamp but by hammer and file, with slight difference in lip and taper that made each one feel made for a particular hand. Beside them lay a draw knife. The handles were dark maple, rubbed smooth. One had a hairline crack bound with copper wire so neatly that the repair seemed part of the tool's dignity. The blade had been oiled before burial. When Connie lifted it, the weight settled across her palms with the serious balance of a thing meant to remove what was unnecessary without damaging what should remain. The draw knife was a copper finishing pan, smaller than the great evaporator, hammered by hand and patched at one corner with a riveted piece shaped like a crescent. The copper had darkened nearly brown, yet where oilcloth had protected it, a faint rose glow remained. Connie touched the dent and remembered Père Etienne's story of his son dropping the pan at 12 years old. Her breath left her in a small sound. Not a sob, not speech, only recognition. The next layer contained clay crocks, sealed with wax and cloth and pine pitch around the lids. They were heavier than she expected, and she lifted them one at a time, placing each on the feed sack with the care due sleeping children. 20 in all, each crock marked by a thumbprint pressed into wet clay before firing, and each tied with a strip of faded linen on which someone had written amber in brown ink. 1 gallon each, if the shape told true. 20 gallons. She knew enough to understand that syrup could spoil if badly stored. She also knew sealed crocks kept in cold stone could preserve more than a person would think possible. She did not open them. Not that night. Their contents belonged to a slower judgment than hunger. In the bottom of rested a tin box. It was rectangular, once painted green, now dulled by age. The lid was bound with a strip of oilcloth. Beneath the oilcloth lay a small American flag folded into triangle, its cotton browned along the edges but still precise, with a Korean War Service ribbon pinned through it. The ribbon had been placed carefully, not displayed, not forgotten. Connie set the flag on the feed sack and removed her gloves. Some objects refused the berry of leather. Under the flag was the tin identification plate. PFC Bélanger, 995D. The letters were stamped into metal by military machinery, exact and impersonal. Yet in the candlelight, the plate seemed more intimate than any photograph. A name reduced to what war required. Rank. Surname. Year. Something to identify a body. A pack. A record. A loss. She held it only long enough to feel its cold. Then came the birch bark tube. It had been fitted into the corner of the box. capped at both ends with whittled cedar plugs and tied around the middle with black thread. The bark was pale under the oil, its papery curl still visible. Connie knew with open it that the letter was inside. She also knew she was not ready to meet it. There were savings bonds beneath, folded in their envelopes, stiff but intact. She counted them by issuer and denomination, not yet understanding what time had made of them. United States Series E savings bond, $50. 25. 10. Names written in a hand she would later know. Together. Face value $520. There were coins too, though not the fortune a story might prefer. A cloth purse held 11 silver $half, 23 quarters, 18 dimes, and 9 nickels, all dated before 951. The halves bore Walking Liberty on some and Franklin on others. The quarters were Washington heads worn soft at the cheek. The dimes included Mercuries, their wing caps nearly smooth from use. She counted twice, placed them in little stacks on the feed sack. $12.45 in coin. In the far corner of the tin, wrapped separately in cotton, was a military medal with a narrow ribbon. Bronze Star medal. The case had cracked at one hinge. Inside, on a folded paper, someone had written Andre Gay. Bélanger. 1951. Connie did not know the campaign. Not yet. She did not know Chosin Reservoir except as a phrase history had not offered her. But she knew her father's storage when she saw it. She knew what it meant to put a medal away with tools instead of on a mantel. She knew there were forms of grief that could keep working only until one more necessary object had been wrapped, sealed, lowered, and covered from sight. The pit was empty now except for a dusting of stone grit and one final thing she almost missed. A brass key, no longer than her thumb, lay near the well where it had slipped under the edge of a crock, was shaped like a maple leaf, each low filed with detail. The stem formed the shaft. It was not tarnished evenly. Someone had handed it often before hiding it, enough that the raised veins shone faintly when she rubbed them with her thumb. She did not know what it opened. She set it beside the identification plate. Then she sat among the objects until the candle burned low and the fire thinned to coals. The front room had changed without moving. The evaporator, the arch, the tools, the sealed crocks, the flag, the plate, the coins, the bonds, the letter waiting in its birch bark tube. Nothing had become simple. Nothing had become easy. She was still cold. The roof still leaked. The wool still leaned. Her count at the hardware store existed because an elder man had chosen trust over caution. She still had almost no money she could spend without consequence. Yet the room no longer felt empty. It felt kept. She gathered the coins back into the cloth purse and wrote the count on the envelope. She copied the bond amounts by candlelight. Twice, because numbers deserved honesty. She returned the medal to its cracked case, folded the flag around it exactly as she had found it, and placed the identification plate on top, where she could see the stamped name. The syrup crocks she left unopened, covered with the feed sack against dust. The tools she rewrapped loosely, not sealing them again, because hiding them a second time would have felt like a lie. The draw knife she laid across the workbench. The spiles she ranged in rows, each lip facing the same direction, 42 in all. The copper pan she set beneath the window, where morning might find its colour. Only the letter remained untouched. She held the birch bark tube once, felt the dry curvet under both hands, and placed it on the shelf beside Père Etienne's chipped mug. "Tomorrow," she said. Her voice startled her. It entered the room and stayed there, small and plain. Then she opened the sliding door and stepped outside. Night had settled clear over the clearing. The clouds had moved east, and stars between the black limbs of the sugar maples. The cold struck her damp face and made her breathe through her teeth. Down the slope, water moved beneath ice in a ditch, hidden but audible, a narrow living thread under winter's weight. She walked toward it without a lantern. At the culvert, she crouched and listened. The water slipped over stone, under snow, through roots, going somewhere it had always known how to go. It did not hurry because she had found what had been hidden. It did not pause because she was afraid to read the letter. It kept exact course in darkness. Connie stayed there until her hands hurt. When she turned to the sap house, the coals had dimmed under ash, but one red line remained. She added 2 splinters, watched them catch, and sat on the floor with her back against the stone arch. The birch bark tube waited on the shelf. The brass key lay beside the stamp plate. The sealed crocks held their amber silence. She did not sleep for a long while. She listened to the building, to the faint work in old timber in cold, to the thaw and freeze in the roof seam, to a mouse that had not yet learned the new arrangement of the room. Her body was exhausted, but her mind moved from object to object, not greedily, not even with wonder, but with the grave attention one gives to names read from a stone. Some sap house are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. Morning came hard and clear, with frost feathered across the inside of the window glass and the cold lying low on the floor. Connie woke beside the stone arch with ash on one sleeve and a cramp in her neck from sleeping upright too long. The fire had gone to dull grey bed, but under the ash, when she stirred it with the iron rake, one coal showed a private red. She fed it kindling no thicker than pencils, wait until flame touched the smallest pieces, and then added a split of old maple that sighed before it caught. She did not reach for the birch bark tube at once. Instead, she made her still ordinary things. She carried water from the well, skimming the ice that had formed in the bucket overnight. She swept the front room again, though there was little new to sweep. She checked the crocks for cracks, the tools for moisture, the savings bonds for any sign that mice had found them. She placed the folded flag on the workbench and set the tinned identification plate beside it, where the stamped letters faced the light. Only then did she take down the tube. The black thread broke after she worried it loose with the tip of the awl. The cedar plug at one end came out with a dry sigh. Inside, the paper had been rolled tightly around itself, protected by the birch bark and years of cold. It was cream-coloured, thick, and faintly rippled. When she drew it out, a smell rose with it. Not old dust exactly, but cedar, smoke, and the closed air of a thing kept from weather. The handrail stopped her before the words did. It leaned slightly to the right, deliberate and strong, with tall capitals and a careful pressure at the end of each line. She had seen that hand once before on the back of a prayer card, where someone had written her name when she was too young to know who had done it. She had seen it in Père Etienne's kitchen on labels tied to jars of beans, on a grocery list pinned near the stove, on a note that said wood under porch dry enough. The letter was dated October 44, num 953. Connie sat on the floor, close enough to the fire for the paper to remain pliable, far enough that no ember could reach it. Then she began. My dear one, whoever you are, If you have found this, then the house has outlasted my strength, my sorrow, and perhaps my stubbornness too. I have hidden these things because I could not use them, could not sell them, and could not bear to watch them scatter through the hands of strangers who would know their price and not their use. A tool may neglect for a while. It does not survive being misunderstood forever. My name is Etienne Joseph Bélanger. I was born in the year 992 on this hill road above Hyde Park, in the same house where my father was born before me. I am writing in Burlington, Vermont, after seeing Dr. Harold Menard at the Mary Fletcher Hospital. He has told me plainly enough what my own body has been telling me in smaller ways. There is a sickness in my blood and in the marrow of my bones. He says I may have a year if I am careful, perhaps less if I am not. I have never been good at measuring life in such terms, but I know enough to set things in order while my hand can still hold a pen. Our people came here with little more than language, tools, and the will to stay through winter. My great-grandfather, Baptiste Bélanger, was born near Siasing in Lower Canada in 1888 and crossed into Vermont as a young man when there was work in timber and stone. He married Marguerite Fournier of Bakersfield in 1842, and together they leased a piece of hillside where maples stood thick enough that a poor man could imagine sweetness as a crop. Their son, Olivier Bélanger, born in 1845, built the first boiling shelter here after coming home from the war years with a cough he never lost. He married Rose Delorme in 1870, and they kept a sugar bush with oxen, wooden buckets, and a fire that burned from dark to dark when the sap ran. My father, Luc Bélanger, was born in 1873. He built this present sap house with his brothers in 1898, setting the founding stones by hand and raising the vented roof before the first hard frost. He married Selina Moreau, who could judge syrup by its bead on a spoon more accurately than any thermometer we later bought. I was their second son, though the first to live beyond infancy. My earliest memory is not a face but steam, white and thick, moving under the cupola while my mother poured coffee from a blue pot and my father told me to keep my fingers away from the pan. I married Anna Levine in 926, and we had one child, André Joseph Bélanger, born March 3, 929. He was the kind of boy who took broken things apart without permission and put them back together better than they had been. At 12, he dropped the copper finishing pan you may have found and wept over the dent as if he had harmed a living creature. I patched it with a crescent because punishment would not have improved either the pan or the boy. After that, he carried it more carefully than he carried him. On November 29, 1950, during the fighting at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, my son was reported missing. The notice came later. Of course, notes as always arrive after the moment they name. By the time the army man stood in our kitchen, winter had already entered Anna's lungs. The official words were brave and clean. Missing in action. Presumed dead. United Nations command. Stream cold. Enemy forces. His effects would follow when possible. No effect of his ever made it back to us except the plate, the ribbon, and what the government placed in an envelope. Anna died the following February with André's last school photograph on the table beside her bed. I do not say she died of grief. That would make grief too simple, and my wife was never a simple woman. Her heart failed after too many weeks of refusing food and listening for footsteps in a yard where none came. I buried her when the ground allowed it. I did not boil that spring. I have not boiled since. 32 seasons have run through these maples without my taking their sap. I have walked among them and seen the buds swell, Heard the crows change their voices in March. Smelled thaw in the south-facing root. I have sharpened the spiles and oiled the draw knife and mended what could be mended. But I could not tap the trees alone. That is the truth of it. A man may be strong in his back and useless in the place where companionship once stood. I sealed these tools beneath the evaporator because Andre helped me forge many of them. His hammer marks are there, not always straight, but honest. The draw knife belonged to my grandfather Olivier. The finishing pan is the one my boy dented. The syrup in the crocks is from our last full boil together. March 1950. Grade A amber. Drawn off clean and sealed while still hot. I do not know whether it will remain fit for table after years in cold stone. Judge it with caution. Waste nothing that can be saved, but do not poison yourself out of reverence. If you mean to sugar here again, remember that maple-work rewards patience more than force. Tap when the nights fall below freezing and the days rise kindly above it, not because a calendar tells you so. Set the spile at a slight upward angle, deep enough to hold but not to punish the tree, usually no more than 1.5 inches beyond the bark on a healthy trunk. Do not tap a tree under 10 inches through. A larger tree may take 2 taps, but only if its crown is sound and you would not be ashamed to explain yourself to the next generation. Sap is mostly water, near 40 gallons to 1 gallon of syrup in ordinary year, though no year is ordinary when you are living inside it. Keep the fire steady on the pan and the sap moving. Foam must be skimmed before it soils the finish. Watch the draw, off near 7 degrees above the boiling point of water, adjusted for the weather and your elevation. Around here that is often near 290 degrees Fahrenheit. But trust your hydrometer when you have one and your eyes when you have earned them. Filter while hot through clean wool or oilon, and do not bottle until the syrup holds its grade and density. A rushed syrup will tell on you later. Never leave the arch hungry for wood during a run. Never let the pan go dry. Never burn trash in a sugaring fire. It tastes to the air, and the air gives a taste to everything. There are bonds in the box, not riches. Own a little money I could not bring mice to spend. There are coins, too, saved by Anna in a cloth purse for a new roof that never came. Use them if you must keep the place standing. If you not need them, leave them for the next one. We not owners for very long. We are only the hands present when a thing asks to be tended. Inheritance is not always land. Sometimes it is a duty wrapped so long in sorrow that no one recognizes it as love. Sometimes it a tool kept sharp by a man who could no longer use it. Sometimes it is a house others call empty because they can't hear what remains inside. If you are kin, know that you were wanted before you were known. If you are not kin, know that welcome does not depend only on blood. The trees will not ask for proof. The fire will not ask who failed you. The work, if you choose it, will teach you what it teaches everyone. Take only what runs clear. Keep watch. Mend before breaking. And leave sweetness behind you in a form someone else can carry. Behind the sap house, where the walnut leaned toward the spring ditch, you will find an iron horseshoe set in the trunk at shoulder height. On placed it there when he was 14, saying luck should be nailed where it could not be misplaced. Beneath that tree, Anna buried a jar with names on paper, our poor attempt at remembering those who came before records cared about us. Look there when the ground softens. It may tell you more than I can fit here. I am tired now, and my hand is less certain than it was at the top of the page. The fire is low. Morning will ask its usual question. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Etienne Joseph Bélanger, October 4 Torn, 9953. Connie reached the bottom of the page and did not move. The fire shifted, dropping one coal inward. Meltwater began its punctual tapping in the dented bucket near the front corner. Somewhere in the well, a mouse made a brief complaint and then accepted the silence again. She held the letter by its lower edges, thumbs on the margins, afraid the warmth of her hands might change it. After a time, she read it again. Not faster. Slower. The second reading entered by different doors. The names. The dates. The hospital. The sun. The exactness of the craft instructions, set down by a dying man who still cared that a stranger not ruin a tree. The sentence about welcome that did not depend only on blood. She stopped there longer than the paper required. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases. She did not improve them. She did not press them flatter. The letter had survived by being itself, and she gave it back its old shape. Then she placed it beside the flag and stood. The back door had swollen in its frame from weather. She worked it open with her shoulder, careful not to force the latch past repair. Outside, the sun had risen high enough to sharpen shadows beneath the maples. The snow in the clearing still held last night's crust, but near the south wall water dripped in thin bright strings from the roof edge. She walked by the sap house toward the ditch. The walnut tree stood apart from the maples, wider and lower limbed, its bark deeply furrowed and dark where melt had run down the trunk. She found the horseshoe almost at once, though it had taken the tree into self over the years. Only the curved crown and two rusted nail heads remained visible. Embedded at shoulder height, the owl swallowed slow by living wood. A branch angled above it like a bent arm. Connie laid her palm against the trunk. The bark was cold, rough, and slightly damp. The horseshoe's iron pressed through the glove at the heel of her hand. Andre had nailed it there at 14, before Korea, before the government telegram, before the tools were wrapped and lowered beneath the pan. A boy doing a foolish practical thing. Luck where it could not be misplaced. She looked down at the snow-covered ground beneath the tree, hard as stone still. Whatever jar Anna had buried would have to wait for Thor. That waiting felt right. The letter had already given more than a person could receive in one morning. Back inside, she searched the workroom with a new attention. Not for treasure. For a candle. She remembered seeing hardened beeswax on the shelf, a lump beside the rusted awl, but in the crate from Tranquil County, under cracked wash basin and straw, she found a narrow paper wrap bundle she had missed during the inventory. The paper broke at the folds. Inside lay 3 hand-dipped candles, yellowed to ivory, twisted at the wick and faintly smelling of honey and dust. On the wrapping, in the same right-leaning hand, someone had written Anna's tapers. Christmas 9941. She held one for a long moment. 60 years of darkness had kept it whole. She placed it in Pépère Etienne's chip mug, wedging the base with a curl of paper so it would stand upright. Then she lit it from the fire with a splinter. The flame caught reluctantly at first, then drew herself into steadiness. It burned differently from tallow, cleaner and warmer in colour. The light touched the copper finishing pan, found the curve of each spile, travelled over the folded flag, and rested on the letter's creases. A thin scent of beeswax entered the room, so domestic and particular that the sap house seemed briefly less abandoned and inhabited by breath just stepped away. Connie sat on the floor and watched the candle. She did not call what happened grief. She did not call it belonging. Names could come later, if they came at all. For now there was only the act of keeping still while light did its work. She thought of the people who had carried her to this morning without knowing the weight of what they had done. The caseworker with cracked lipstick, pressing 2/4 into her palm as if rules were not the same thing as rightness. Mrs. Leahy in the parish hall, setting a heel of bread beside Connie's hand and refusing to ask for proof of need. The woman at the general store who had added the extra matchbook without looking directly at the gesture. Mr. Whitcomb writing her name on an account card before she had earned the trust he gave her. Mrs. Porter reading every clause aloud, then placing the $1 apart in the cash box, as if the transfer had required more witness than the county seal could provide. No one had saved her. That was not how the chain had worked. Each person had done something modest enough to deny if challenged. A coin. Bread. Matches. Credit. Slow directions. A form read carefully. Each case was too small to solve a life, yet together they made a path firm enough for one cold girl to walk. And maybe that was how houses survived too. Not by grand rescue. By one hand replacing one board before weather entered. One person oiling one tool. One letter sealed because someone might come. One candle saved until the dark was deep enough to need it. If you are watching this tonight from a warm room, perhaps you remember one small kindness that reached you when nothing else did. Not the kind that made a story neat. Just a hand on a counter. A ride offered without pressure. A meal wrapped for later. A sentence said at the right time and then never mentioned again. Tell us about it in the comments if you can. Someone reading may be standing in a hard season, and your memory might become a match struck carefully in their own dark place. The candle burned lower. Connie moved the heirlooms one by one before nightfall. Not far. Just near enough that she could sleep beside them without knocking them over. The spiles remained their rows on the workbench, but the draw knife she wrapped again and laid to her right. The copper finishing pan rested near the well where no drip could reach it. The savings bonds went back in the tin box with the coins and key. The flag, ribbon, identification plate, and medal she placed on the flattened cardboard at the head of her makeshift bed, not as decoration, but as if a watch had been assigned. The letter she returned the birch bark tube, then tucked the tube inside Pépère Etienne's mug after the candle had burned down enough to lift free. Before lying down, she banked the fire with ash. Then she stretched out on the floor. Coat buttoned, shoes still on, body fold around cold and exhaustion and something quieter than hope. Outside, the ditch moved beneath ice. Inside, the sap house held objects. Its names. Its waiting. Connie slept with the heirlooms beside her. The first snow that stayed came on December 3, and by morn there were 6 inches on the roof. Connie knew the number because she measured it with a broken yardstick from the workroom. Standing in the doorway while dawn made the clearing blue and the sugar maples stood with every branch outlined in white. The tin roof had held, but not honourably. Melt from the day before had frozen under the seams, and now the new weight pressed down with a silence that felt less like peace than waiting pressure. She did not climb at once. She read the roofing chapter in Mr. Whitcomb's manual 3 times. Sitting beside the stone arch with her knees tucked under the army blanket Doris from the cafe had sent through Mrs. Porter. First reading for sense. Second for order. Third for the parts that could kill a person if pride skipped them. She copied the words she needed on the back of envelope. Sister rafter. Roof pitch. Felt overlap. Drip edge. Chalk line. Nail pattern. Flashing. Ridge cap. The sap house roof was 24 feet along the ridge and 16 feet across the width, with a simple gable pitch steep enough to shed snow when it wished to. Each side measured roughly 4 by 10, allowing for overhang, damage, and mistakes. Mr. Whitcomb helped her draw the arithmetic on the counter at the hardware store with a carpenter's pencil and a flattened feed invoice. "Call it 500 square feet with waste," he said. Connie watched the pencil move. 3-tab asphalt is cheapest, he added. "But that building wants metal." "I can't afford." "No, you cannot." So they made a roof meant not to be beautiful, only honest enough to keep winter outside. 8 bundles of brown 3-tab shingles, at $9.75 each, placed on account. 2 rolls of fit-pound roofing felt, $6.20 each. 5 pounds of 1¼ inch galvanized roofing nails. 1 strip of salvage drip edge from a torn-down shed, straightened by hand. A small can of roofing cement for seams that could not yet be made perfect. Chalk line. Utility blades. Borrowed hammer. Borrowed ladder. Borrowed courage, though no one wrote that down. When Connie saw the total, her mouth went dry. "Mr." Whitcomb closed the ledger. "Roof is not extravagance." "I know." "Then carry only what your back can answer for." He did not let her carry the shingles that day. He sent them in the bay of an old pickup driven by a man named Silas Crow, a retired roofer with one clouded eye, a grey beard cut square at the chin, and hands that looked too large for the wrist holding them. Silas wore a cap with ear flaps and a canvas coat patched at both elbows. He drove without hurry and spoke only when necessary. At the sap house, he stood in the clearing and looked up. "Bad ridge." Connie nodded. "Worse north side?" "Yes." "Sir, you planning to learn or just survive?" She considered this. "Both." He gave one short breath that might have been approval. Silas refused pay before she offered it. "Mr." Whitcomb had sent him, though he pretended he had only been passing through with 8 bundles of shingles, felt, nails, and a roofing hatchet that had belonged to his older brother. The hatchet was narrow-headed, its handle dark with use, its nail notch worn bright. Silas placed it in Connie's hand. "Dead man's tool," he said. "Use it careful." For 11 days. The roof became their weather and their clock. They worked only when the surf was dry enough to trust and the wind did not make ladders foolish. Silas made Connie clear the snow first from the ground, then from the lower roof edge with a rake made from a board and 2 nails. He would not let her rush upward. He taught from below, then from the first rung, then from the roof itself, always in small increment that treated fear as information rather than weakness. The north side had 2 rafters softened near the eave. He showed her how to sister them with sound lumber, not by removing the damaged timber in winter, but by fastening new boards tight alongs the old, carrying load from plate to ridge. She held the sister raft in place while Silas marked the angle with a square. Then she cut badly, then better, then close enough that he only grunted and handed her the hammer. Flash. She adjusted. Again. She adjusted. "That will hold." The words warmed more than they should have. They stripped the worst of the rusted tin where it had torn loose, leaving sections that still served as decking under the new felt. Where boards had failed, they patched with planks from a collapsed shed mister. Whitcomb knew about, pulling old nails one by one and stacking them in a jar because waste offended everyone involved. Silas showed her how to snap a chalk line straight across a roof, how to measure exposure so each row of shingles would lie even, how to stagger seams so water would not be given a road. His teaching was terse. That nail's proud. Pull too high. Again. Watch your foot. Look at the air. 3 stroke. The stroke nail became a kind of lesson. First stroke to set. Second to drive. Third to seat without bruising the shingle. Connie bent more nails than she wished to remember. Silas made her pull each one. A crooked nail hidden under the next course was a future leak, and a future leak was a light all to weather. By the 6th day, her palms had blistered under the gloves. By the 8th, her shoulders learned the rhythm of shingles passed from stack to roof, from roof to hand, from hand to place. By the 9th, snow fell again, not enough to stop them, but enough to make each surface slick and each breath visible. Silas worked as if he had made an agreement with gravity many decades before and trusted it only under supervision. On the 10th day, they set the ridge cap. Connie straddled the roof line with both knees braced, the hills opening around her in pale winter distance. Hyde Park lay hidden by trees and folds of land, but a church bell carried faintly through the afternoon. Smoke rose from farms below. The sugar bush stood behind the sap house, each maple holding snow in the forks of its branches. Silas placed the final cap shingle and handed her the hatchet. You finished. She drove the last nail in 3 strokes. The 11th day was for flashing the chimney with what material they had, bedding edges in roofing cement, checking seams, clearing debris, and walking perimeter twice from the ground. Silas stood back with his hands in his pockets, one eye narrowed against the light. Not pretty. Connie looked at the roof. No, sir. Dry matters more. That night, December 4 fawn, a hard sleet came against the sap house from the west. It ticked on the new shingles, ran toward the eaves, and fell outside. Connie set out the dented bucket in its old place from habit, then sat beside fire listening. The bucket remained empty. January took the sap house into its fist and held it there. The days stayed in the 20s, sometimes lower, with mornings so cold that the tin cup froze to the shelf if she forgot to set it upside down. Snow hardened into layers along the foundation. The well rope stiffened. Breath made white curtains in the front room until the fire had worked for an hour. Even then, the corners remained cold enough to preserve silence. The chimney, once trussed for small fires, began to reveal its deeper ruin. Connie saw it first powder on the stone arch. Not soot this time, but pale mortar dust fallen in a fan beneath the brick throat. Then she found spalling along the exposed stack above the roof line, where moisture had entered brick faces and frozen until the surfaces flaked away in thin red scales. The crown was worse than Silas had said from the ground. What had opened in 2 joints. One brick at the western edge could be shifted with 2 fingers. Mr. Whitcomb came to look on a morning when the temperature was 19 degrees and the sun had no warmth in it. He stood inside with his hand folded over the top of the stove rake, examining the arch, the throat, the cracked joints, the places where careless fire would become catastrophe. You not need pretty brickwork, he said. I need it not to kill me. That is the proper standard. He sold her what he called the least foolish version of repair. A small bag of hydraulic lime, fire clay, clean sand from a covered bin behind the store, a stiff brush, a pointing trowel second-hand from a mason who had retired with arthritis. He did not sell Portland cement for the old joints. Too hard, he said. Old brick needs a mortar that yields before the brick does. She wrote the mixture down as he spoke, 2 parts clean sand, 1 part hydraulic lime for exterior joint, for firebox and throat repair, 3 parts sand, 1 part fire clay, 1 part lime. Mix stiff, not soupy. Dampen the old brick before packing. Rake joints back to sound material. Press mortar deep. Tool the joint. Protect from freezing too fast if you can. In January. That last instruction sounded almost cruel. For 3 weeks, Connie became intimate with broken mortar. She worked in short periods because the cold reached through gloves and into bone. Every 15 minutes. Her fingers began to lose their separate names. Thumb, index, middle, ring, little. They became one blunt ache. She warmed them near the fire, careful not to heat numbskin too quickly. Then returned to the joints with brush, chisel, trowel, and patience. The inside work came first. She laid a canvas feed sack on the chimney opening, then scraped loose mortar until the brush brought down no more dust. Each joint had to be raked back at least 3/4 of an inch where it had failed, more where old lime had turned to powder. She misted brick with war-warmed in the tin cup, watching steam lift briefly before the surface drank it in. Then she pressed the fire clay mix into the gaps with the edge of the trowel, packing from back to front so no hollow pocket remained. Her first joints were clumsy. Too round, too proud. She scraped them out and did them again. No one saw that part. The failures did not count less because they were private. They were the true tuition. Outside work was harder. Silas had left the ladder tied under the eave, and on calm days Connie climbed with the pointing trowel tucked into her belt and mortar carried in a coffee can. The roof held. That fact never stopped being new. She moved along the shingles on her knees, avoiding frost, leaning in the chimney with her shoulder against cold brick while wind tried to slide beneath her coat. The spalled faces could not be made whole, but the worst bricks could be turned and reset where possible, or patched enough to resist another season. She removed the loose crown material and shaped a low wash of lime mortar so meltwater would not sit flat on top. It was not a mason's pride. It was a winter's bargain. By the second week, her hands had cracked across the knuckles. Lime found each opening and made a white sting. She wrapped the worst cuts with strips torn from old shirt and worked anyway, because chimneys did not care whether a person felt prepared. On January 21, snow fell all day and she did no roof work. Instead, she sat by the fire and cleaned each hand, forged spile with fine steel wool mister. Whitcomb had allowed on account. She did not shine them. She removed only what should not remain, a bloom of surface rust, old wax, the dust of hiding. Hammer marks emerged under her fingers. Some were sure. Some wandered. Andre's marks, perhaps, or his father's, or another hand before both. That evening, she held one spile to the candle and understood more of what the letter meant. A tool could outlive the certainty of its maker. It could wait through war, debt, roof leak, mice, county notices, and a girl with no place else to go. It could remain self under neglect, provided someone had oiled it once with care. The final chimney repair came near the end of the month, on January 28. The air rose to above freezing for 3 hours. Brief mercy that softened snow on the south side and sent water ticking from branches. Connie mixed the last of the mortar, climbed to the stack, and finished the crown with both hands shaking from effort. She covered it with a scrap of tar paper and weighted the corners with stones until the initial set could take. Then she came down slowly, each rung of the ladder a negotiation. The test fire waited until the following evening. She opened the door to give draught, cleared the arch, and built the fire properly this time, small kindling, dry maple splits. No trash, no damp bark, no hurry. The match took. Flame climbed. Smoke lifted straight. She went outside with her coat unbuttoned and stood in the clearing, looking up. From the chimney rose a narrow column of smoke, clean and pale against the darkening sky. It did not roll from cracks, did not leak under the eaves. It did not stain the room behind her. It rose. Connie stood there until the cold made her eyes water, and still she watched. Because a repaired chimney is not merely brick, it is permission to trust fire again. The floors waited until she could bear to look down long enough. For weeks, they had been only surfaces underfoot, measured by danger and creep, swept enough to sleep on, crossed enough to work. But after the roof held and the chimney breathed clean, the white pine planks began to show them as something more than a thing not yet ruined. They were wide, some nearly 14 inches, hand-planed with faint waves still visible when the light slanted across them. Their nails were old rose heads, irregular and dark, driven by someone who had understood both wood and weather. The front room had suffered most. Ash had ground self in the grain. Sap, spilled across decades, had hardened in amber-black stains near the evaporator. Mice had made narrow paths along the wall. In 2 places, boards cupped upward where damp had entered. Near the south sill, one plank had softened so badly that Connie marked it with chalk and refused to step there until repair could come. Still, most of the floor remained. That felt like a form of forgiveness. Mr. Whitcomb rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, a price that made her swallow before nodding. He included 3 sanding discs at 80 grit, 3 at 1, 20, and 2 at 2, 20, each one written carefully on her account card. He showed her how to keep the machine moving, never pausing in place, never tipping the edge down, never trying to grind history out in one path. "You are cleaning," he said, "not erasing." She carried the sander back in a burlap sack, its cord looped around the handle, and borrowed power from the hardware store by another kindness she did not ask for. Mr. Whitcomb knew a farmer whose generator had been taken in trade for a bill. The machine coughed, smoked, and shook like an elder animal, but it ran. Silas hauled it up the track with his pickup when weather allowed, then left without staying to watch her gratitude become difficult. The first pass was 80 grit. The sander bucked at first, and Connie held it too tightly until her arms burned. Dust rose immediately, fine and pale, carrying the smell of pine released from bean ash. She wore the mask. She tied a scarf around her hair. She moved with the grain, board by board, never crossing too fast, never lingering over stains that had earned their place. The room filled with a golden haze that firelight later turned almost visible enough to touch. At the end of the first day, the worst grime had lifted, and the floor looked wounded rather than dead. The second pass, 120 grit, changed the sound. The sander no longer rasped but hummed. Grain lines appeared with a clearer face. Knots deepened. Nail heads showed like dark stars. Connie knelt afterward with a hand brush, clearing dust from between boards, from nail pockets, from the seam around the cedar disc she had replaced over the stone-lined pit but not resealed. She could not bring herself to hide that open again. Instead, she fitted the disc cleanly and laid a flat stone over it, a marker visible only to some who already knew. The third pass, 220 grit, was almost tender work. By then, her body knew the machine. She moved slowly, guiding rather than wrestling, letting the disc smooth raised fibres left by winter damp and years of neglect. Outside, late January sun fell on snow with a brightness that made the windows seem whiter than glass. Inside, the pine began to show colours she had not expected. Dark honey near the hearth, reddish-brown where sap had spilled and aged, almost mahogany worn by feet tending boy after boil after boil. She finished after dark and returned the sander the next morning before another day's fee could attach itself to her name. The oil came later that week. Tung oil cut with a small portion of mineral spirits for the first coat, then 2 coats of boiled linseed oil mist. Whitcomb approved with reluctance because it was what she could afford. He warned her about oily rags. They burn thems if you ball them. Yes, sir. Not a story. A fact. She'll every rag flat outs on stone after use, weighted by pebbles, until fully dry. The first coat entered the wood almost greedily. Connie worked on her knees with a folded cloth, rubbing oil in the grain in long strokes, watching dull pine deepen bind her hand. The floor drank at different rates. Near the arch, old heat had tightened the boards, and the oil sat long before sinking. Near the back room, damp wood darkened quickly. She waited 48 hours before the next coat, though impatience made itself known in every passing glance. The second coat brought the honey forward. The third gave depth. When the final cure began, she walked only in stocking feet, stepping along boards she had left uncovered near the wall. She did not own proper stockings without holes, but the gesture mattered. A should not be greeted first by road salt and boot grit. There was one bad morning. It came off the second coat, when the room smelled of oil and winter sunlight, and her whole body seemed to have been made from damp rope. She woke before dawn and could not make us rise. Not from laziness, not from decision. The will that had carried her through roof work, chimney work, floor dust, hunger, cold, accounts, and memory simply did not appear when called. The fire was low. The room was grey. Her hands hurt. The repaired roof ticked above her. Somewhere under the floor, a mouse moved with more purpose than she could find. She sat up, then remained sitting for nearly an hour. At last, she put on her coat and walked away from the sap house. Not to town. Not to ask for help. Not to abandon it. She walked east through the trees until the land dipped toward a marsh, where cattails stood frozen in brown ranks above the ice. Snow lay smooth except where fox tracks crossed from alder to alder. A great blue heron stood at the open edge of a spring seep, impossibly still, its longy grey against grey water, one leg lifted into its feathers. Connie stopped far enough away not to disturb it. All morning, she watched. The heron did almost nothing. It lowered its head once. It stepped twice. It waited with a patience older than weather, neither idle nor urgent. Around it, the marsh held winter without complaint. Ice, reeds, water, breath. No improvement, no repair, no visible progress. By noon, Connie's feet were numb. She returned to the sap house and did not work that day. She made soup from an onion Doris had left in a paper bag, banked the fire, and sat on the newly oiled floor without touching the tools. The house did not punish her for stopping. The roof did not fail. The chimney did not forget its draft. The floor cured in its own time. Some sap houses are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. February brought light back by inches, and with it the condition of the windows became impossible to ignore. There were 8 in all. 4 along the south wall where the winter sun entered low, 2 in the front room facing the clearing, 1 in the back room above the workbench, 1 narrow window near the door, its frame older than the others, its wavy glass catching flame at night in a trembling amber line. 3 had no glass. Cardboard and feed sacks had been tacked over the openings, softened by damp and gnawed by mice. 4 had cracked panes held together by habit, frost, or dirt. The last was original, or near enough that Mr. Whitcomb told her not to touch it except with reverence and a dry cloth. The glass in that one, he said, dated to earliest build, perhaps 8898, though an old pencil mark on the sash read Evan 88, likely reused from some older house or barn window when practical people wasted nothing. Do not replace that pane, he said. I was not going to. You might have been tempted. I was afraid of it. Good. Fear saves what confidence breaks. He sold her DAP 3 glazing putty. 1 small tub. Glazier's point driver he let her borrow. Replacements cut from salvaged panes. And 20 feet of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. He gave her folded sheet showing how a counterweight window worked, though several of Connie's did not work any more and one had never worked at all. He drew a figure 8 knot at the bottom of the page. That knot holds when simple knots get clever and fail. Window work required a different patience from roofing and mortar. It was indoor work, but not warm work, and it demanded hands that could be firm without violence. Connie removed the cardboard first and found the rooms immediately brighter and colder. Wind entered with a clean blade. Dust lifted from shelves. The fire leaned toward the new drafts as if listening. She carried each sash to the workbench when possible, marking its location in pencil so it would return to the right opening. The first sash came free grudgingly, its paint cracked and its lower rail swollen. She scraped old putty with the cracked knife, then softened stubborn patches by holding them near. Not over. The fire. Too much heat would crack old glass. Too little would do nothing. The right amount was learned by failure in small pieces. Old glazing came away like stone in some places and like stale cheese in others. Beneath it, metal glazer's points emerged, rusted but determined. Connie pried them carefully and saved those worth saving in a jar. The cracked glass she wrapped in newspaper and set aside behind the woodpile, not trusting her to carry too much at once over snow. For the new panes. Mr. Whitcomb had cut glass slight smaller than the sash openings, leaving the narrow breathing room wood required. Connie bedded each pane into a thin rope of putty pressed around the rabbet, set the glass gently, then drove glazier's points just enough to hold without biting too deep. After that came the visible putty, rolled between palms into cord, pressed along the edge, and told at an angle with the putty knife. Her first line looked like a child's pie crust. She scraped off and tried again. By the 3rd window, the bevel grew cleaner. By the 5th, her wrist began to understand that putty was not forced into beauty. It was guided. The knife angle mattered. Pressure mattered. Warm hands help. Cold putty resisted every intention and recorded irritation plainly. The sash cords were worse. in the south window nearest the arch. The old cord had snapped years earlier, leaving the sash dead in its frame and the counterweight lost inside the pocket. Connie removed the trim carefully, numbering pieces in pencil. Behind it, dust lay thick, and the iron weight hung at the bottom like a forgotten pendulum. She tied the new 1/4-inch cotton cord to a small nut, fed it over the pulley, fished it through with a bent wire, then tied the figure 8 knot at the counterweight exactly as Mr. Whitcomb had drawn. The first time, the knot jammed too high. She untied it with cold fingers and did it again. The second time, the sash moved. Not smoothly. Not like a new window, but it rose 6 inches and stayed there, admitting February air by choice rather than damage. Connie lowered it, raised it, lowered it again, and then stood in the room with one hand on the rail. Function had a beauty no curtain could improve. She saved the original marked window for last. That sash stayed in place. She cleaned around it with a dry brush and cloth, removing dust from the muntins without disturbing brittle putty that still held. The wavy pane bent the clearing outside into softened shape. Through it, the walnut tree appeared slightly bowed, the horseshoe hidden on the far side of its trunk. Firelight behind Connie reflected faintly in the glass, giving the strange impression that the room held both past and present in the same thin surface. The last repaired window was the back room one above the workbench. Snow had begun to fall again, slow and sparse, each flake visible against the dark trunks beyond. Connie set the final pane, pressed the last glazier's points, and told the putty line with the care of someone signing a name no county office would record. Her hands were red from cold. A smeary marked her sleeve. The room smelled of linseed oil, old pine, wood smoke, and the faint chalky mineral scent of fresh glazing. As she lifted the sack into its frame, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It was so close that she could see the neat black cap, the white cheek, the bead bright eye. The bird tilted its head toward the new repaired glass, then toward Connie, as if considering the matter of occupancy. Its claws held the branch through a small tremor of wind. Snow collected along its back for 1 second before shaking free. Connie did not move. The chickadee remained long enough to make the room feel observed, then flicked away in the maples with a brief soft beat of wings. Connie lowered the sash. The pane held. The putty line held. The room held its warmth a little longer than it had the day before. She cleaned the knife, capped the glazing tub, and set the borrowed tools in a row for return. Outside, winter continued its exact work. Inside, the sap house gathered what had been given back to it, a roof that shed water, a chimney that drew smoke, a floor that remembered feet, and windows that no longer mistook every wind for entrance. By late February, the walls began asking for attention in their own powdery way. For most of the winter, Connie had treated the plaster as background, the pale skin of the sap house, cracked and smoke, stained but still clinging to the hand-split oak lath beneath. It had survived roof leak, mice, frost, and years of spring damp, and that survival made its failures easier to see. 3 patches near the chimney had loosened, each one sagging away from the well in a shallow belly. When she pressed the largest with 2 fingers, it answered with a dry crunch. Mr. Whitcomb called it horsehair plaster before she asked. You see the fibres, he said, lifting one fallen piece from her paper bag at the store counter. Original enough. Do not replace it with woolboard unless you want the room to forget self. I do not. He nodded as if she had answered a moral question. behind the failed areas. The oak lath remained sound, split by hand and nailed in uneven line. The gaps between strips held old keys of plaster where the first coat had pushed through and hardened decades earlier. Connie cleaned each opening with a stiff brush, not too aggressively, because old houses resented being treated like new lumber. Dust came down in pale cloud. So did bits of mouse nest, one dead beetle, and the faint smell of lime released from a long sleep. The hardware store had a sack of old horsehair in the back room, tied with twine and marked 9 feet 7 in pencil. It had belonged to Mr. Whitcomb's father, kept for a repair no one had made. He sold her only what she needed and then gave back half the coin she offered. Too much hair makes it lumpy, he said. Too little, and it will crack. The mix was lime mortar, sharp sand, water, and hair teased apart by hand until it disappeared through the batch in fine dark threads. The first coat, the scratch coat, was pressed hard through the lath gaps until it mushroomed behind the strips and locked itself there. Connie scored it while damp with the edge of the trowel, making diagonal lines so the next coat would have something to hold. It looked rough and ugly. That comforted her. Necessary work often did. The brown coat came 3 days later, after she had kept the room above freezing with small, steady fires and an old blanket pinned near the doorway to hold warmth where it mattered. 3/8 of an inch, Mr. Whitcomb had said. Not guessed. Measured by eye only after the hand knew what 3/8 meant. Connie did not yet trust her eye. So she marked a scrap of wood and checked the depth until her wrist grew wiser. The brown coat had to cure 72 hours. She waited. Waiting had become less empty by then. She cleaned tools. She carried water. She rubbed oil in the draw knife handle. She copied craft instructions from the letter onto clean sheet and pinned it inside the cabinet door. She walked to the walnut tree and stood by the iron horseshoe, watching snow soften around the trunk, but not enough for digging. The finished coat was thin, 1/8 of an inch, pale and smooth under the trowel. Connie worked slowly in overlapping strokes, feathering the edges into the old wall until the repair no longer announced itself. It would always be visible to someone who knew where to look. That did not trouble her. Honest mending did not need to disguise its existence. When the final patch had tightened and the surface had lost its wet shine, she stood back with the trowel still in her hand. The room was not new. It was better than new. These patches will hold another 100 years, she said. Her voice entered the room without apology. The walls kept it. Doris Avery owned the cafe beside the pharmacy, though everyone in town still called it Maze because names, once set, could outlive deeds and menus. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her early 60s, with flour always at one cuff and hair pinned under a scarf printed with red cherries. Her cafe served coffee strong enough to stand in, corn chowder on Fridays, chicken and biscuits when weather turned mean, and pie by the wedge to men who claimed they were only stopping for coffee. She had seen Connie first as a figure passing the steamed window, too thin for the coat she wore, carrying hardware store parcels as if each one might be taken away. The first paper bag appeared on the sap house doorstep 3 days after the roof stopped leaking. Connie found it at dawn, folded at the top and waited with a jar of beans. Inside were 2 rolls. An onion, a heel of wrapped in wax paper, and a note written on the back of an order pad. Too much made. Do not bring back the jar. Connie carried the bag inside and set it on the workbench. She did not touch it for several minutes. Gifts required a kind of courage from the person receiving them. They asked you to believe that no debt had been hidden under the wrapping. The second bag came a week later. Potatoes, coffee ground tied in cheesecloth, 3 carrots, a biscuit hard enough to survive travel, and a slice of molasses cake in brown paper. On the third morning, Connie walked to the cafe before opening time. Doris was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hands white with flour. The back door stood open a foot to cool the room. "I have to pay you," Connie said. Doris did not look up from rolling dough. "No, you don't." "I don't." "Then pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Connie stood there with snow melting from her shoes on the rubber mat. "I do not have a shop." Doris cut circles from the dough with a water glass. "Not today." That was the whole conversation. After that, the bags kept coming. Not every day. Never enough to make charity visible. Only often enough to keep hunger from becoming the loudest thing in the sap house. Doris never left the bags when Connie was watching. Connie never asked how she climbed the track in winter. Though once she found tire chains printed in the snow and once a deep boot mark by the door that did not match any customer she knew. Caleb Pike was 13, maybe 14, narrow as a rail, with a Schwinn bicycle too large for him and a cowlick that no winter hat could defeat. He arrived in late February with a splitting maul across the handlebars, pedalling up the frozen track in such an unsteady manner that Connie stepped out ready to witness injury. The bicycle slid twice before he reached the clearing. He put one foot down hard, nearly dropped the maul, and then pretended none of it had happened. "You need wood split," he said. "I can split." "Not far." He wore a patched green parka, rubber boots, and mittens tied through his sleeves with yarn like a much younger child. His face was red from the climb, and his breath came in bursts he tried to hide. Connie noticed his surname later, on a school notebook tucked under the bicycle strap, and felt something in her close around itself. Pike. But he was no one who had closed a door on her. He was a boy with chapped lips and a borrowed maul, standing in a clearing because someone had sent him. "I cannot pay," she said. "I know." "Then why are you here?" He shifted his weight. "My mother said." "About what?" "About your grandfather. He would not take money. He would not take coffee because he claimed not to like it, though he accepted hot water with a spoon. Syrup from one of the crocks after Connie finally opened a small test jar and found the amber still clear. He split wood badly at first. Let him maul glance off knot and grain, but he had stubborn arms and a good ear for correction. "Stand wider," Connie told him. He did. Let the head fall. He tried again. By noon, there were 2 uneven stacks beneath the eaves. By the 3rd visit, the stacks were neater. By the 5th, Caleb had learned to read a check in the log before swinging and to turn difficult pieces so the grain answered instead of argued. He talked rarely, mostly about school buses, snow days, and how his bicycle chain slipped in low gear. Connie answered in kind. Neither asked for more than the other could give. Reverend Boyd walked past every morn at 7:30, where the snow fell, sleet hardened, or the road turned to mud at the edges. He was pastor of White Church in the village, a tall man with a brown overcoat brushed thin at the cuffs and a brimmed hat he touched with 2 fingers when greeting anyone, including crows. His route took him along the town road below Sap House track, then toward the cemetery, then back by the post office. Connie first saw him from the trees while carrying water, his figure moving through early light with the steady pace of someone who had learned not to hurry prayers or errands. For 3 mornings. He only tipped his hat when she came into view. On the 4th, He paused at the foot of the track, looked up toward the sap house, and said, "Lord, keep this house." 4 words. No sermon followed. No inquiry. No expectation that she answer. He continued walking. After that, the prayer came most mornings when he saw smoke rising from the chimney or Connie crossing the clearing with a bucket. Sometimes she heard only the low shape of his voice through the trees, not the words. Sometimes he tipped his hat and passed without speaking, as if silence, too, could be reverent when offered without intrusion. One morning, after a night of high wind, Connie found a bundle of kindling tied with twine beside the gate. Tucked under the knot was a church bulletin folded to show the blank side. On it, written in square careful letters, were the same 4 words. "Lord, keep this house." She pinned it inside the workroom near Etienne's sugaring instructions, not because she had become certain of God, because the house had room for any blessing that arrived without demand. The cellar waited until February 1. Connie had known of its existence for weeks, though not from entering. A wooden hatch behind the workroom table had been swollen shut when she arrived. Its iron ring rusted flat against the boards. Drafts came around it in certain winds, carrying a damp stone smell distinct from the rest of the building. She postponed it because roof, chimneys, floors, windows, and walls had made stronger claims. She postponed it also because downward places ask for a steadiness she did not always possess. On the morning she finally opened it, the sky was high and white, and the cold had softened just enough to make metal kinder to touch. She pried the ring loose with the draw knife only after wrapping the blade in cloth, unwilling to misuse it bare. The hatch gave slowly, lifting with a groan that carried through the floor. Beneath it, 7 granite steps descended in darkness, each one worn in the centre by feet long gone. Cold air rose at once, smelling of fieldstone, earth, stored apples that were no longer there, and water travelling somewhere behind walls. She tied a rope to the iron hinge, set the lantern on the first step, and waited for the flame to prove the air below was not wrong. It burned steady. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet, more or less, with a fieldstone floor laid flatter than expected and walls built of stones fitted without ornament. Moisture darkened the lower courses. A shelf ran along the east wall, empty except for 3 glass jars, a mouse skull, and a broken crock lid. Roots no thicker than thread had entered near the north corner and hung there pale as hair. In the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not belong to rougher stones around it. Its surface was rectangular, smooth but not polished, with a carved mark in the middle, a maple leaf above a shallow pan, crossed by what might have been a draw knife or a sugaring arch. The craft mark had been cut with patience, each line still holding shadow after decades underground. Connie stood over it a long time. Every instinct that had led her to the cedar disc asked her to lift it. She did not. The slab was too heavy, too deliberate, and too central to be opened in winter by a girl alone with a borrowed lantern and no one expecting her back before dark. Some secrets were not refusals. Some were appointment with a future body stronger, better fed, and less desperate. She left the slab where it was. On the way back up, her boot struck something under the 3rd step. At first she thought it was a stone loosened by frost. She knelt, lifted the lantern, and saw a small oak block wedged into the shadow where the riser had cracked away. It had been hidden by dirt, spider silk, and the angle of ascent. The block was no larger than a Bible, It's by two brass hinges green at the edges. There was no lock. Inside lay a brass key in a photograph. The key was shaped like a maple leaf at the bow, similar to the one from the pit but smaller. Its teeth cut differently, its stem rubbed bright by some earlier hand. Wrapped around it was a narrow strip of linen with no writing. Connie placed it on her palm beside the lantern and watched the flame move along its veins. The photograph was a tintip, dark and silvery, protected by folded cloth that had most surrendered to age. A young woman stood in front of the sap house, though the building behind her looked newer, with a straighter roofline and brighter clapboards. She wore a dark skirt, a high collared blouse, and boots planted firmly in spring mud. In both hands she held a draw knife across her waist, not like a prop, but like something she knew how to use. Her face made Connie sit back on the step. It was not identical. Time does not copy itself so bluntly. But the set of the eyes, the shape of the mouth when not smiling, the narrow chin, the straight brow, the watchful stillness of someone used to listening before speaking. Connie saw kinship there before she permitted the word. On the back, in faded ink, was Selina Moreau Bélanger, daughter of Lucien Moreau, age 25, summer of 993, not daughter of the founder. Exactly, unless founding belonged to those who kept work alive as much as to those who raise walls. Connie carried the photograph upstairs with both hands. She set it on the mantel shelf beside the brass key. The key did not yet tell her what it opened. The photograph did not explain why it had been hidden under the stair. The granite slab remained below, patient under the fieldstone cold. For once, Connie did not demand the next answer from the same day. March came first in sound. Not warmth. Not green. Sound. The creek below the culvert grew loud under its ice. Then louder. Then suddenly visible in broken places where water pushed dark and urgent over stone. Snow retreat from the south wall in a narrow band, exposing last autumn's leaf flat into brown paper. The walnut tree began dropping brack husks that clung all winter, and by the end of the month its catkin in small green, brown tassels, patient and plain. The sugar maples changed more subtle. Their buds swelled at the tips, red against grey sky. Crows took on their spring voices. Squirrels crossed the upper branches with revived impatience. On days when the nights froze hard and afternoons lifted above 35, Connie could hear water moving inside the world. Not always with the ear. Sometimes with the skin. She did not tap. Every instruction in the letter told her when she could. Every clean spile waited in its row. The buckets, such as they were, could be repaired. The arch could hold fire. The finishing pan had been polished enough to show its copper colour in the right light. In another story, she might have rushed toward the first run as proof of healing. Connie had learned not to confuse readiness with permission. She walked the sugar bush instead, counting trees, measuring trunks with a strip of cloth marked in inches, noting crown damage, frost cracks, bold scars, and the slope of ground where sap could be carried without ruining her back. Trees under 10 inches she marked as no. Larger trees she did not yet mark yet. She wrote perhaps beside them in pencil, because the word left room for weather, knowledge, and humility. She ordered only small materials from town, a thermometer she could not yet trust us to use quick, a hydrometer she would pay off over months, fresh wool filter squares, and food-safe bottles stored for a future season. She spent 1 silver dime from Anna's purse to buy a handful of maple sugar candy from Doris, not to eat all at once, but to study texture and grain with her tongue, learn the difference between sweetness and skill. Most practice happened in miniature. She boiled water to watch steam. She heat a small measure of old syrup from a test crock, never wasting more than a spoonful, learning how foam gathered at the edge and how heat changed scent before colour. She made wooden spile plugs from scrap maple with the draw knife, not because she needed them yet, but because the tool should not remain ceremonial. She sharpened, shaved, ruined, tried again. Her first plugs were crooked. The 10th fit cleanly into drilled scrap without split it. By April, mud took the track and made every trip to town slower. Caleb pushed his bicycle more than rode it. Doris switched from stew bones to eggs and spring onions in the paper bags. Reverend Boyd's morning prayer came through birdsong rather than snow. Silas stopped by once, looked at the roof line, and said nothing, which Connie had learned was his highest form of reassurance. The sap house smelled different then, less of closed ash, more of damp earth, oil, lime, thawing wood, and the faint sweets released when sun warmed the old evaporator pan. Connie opened the repaired windows on mild afternoons and let air cross from front room to back. Dust lifted. Smoke memories tinned. Light stayed long on the floor. She wrote a list for next winter and pinned it under the church bulletin. More wood. Better buckets. Test old syrup safely. Repair south sill. Ask Whitcomb about food-grade seal. Read about grading. Do not hurry trees. At the bottom, without planning to, she wrote one more line. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 1984, the first finished syrup came off the fire just before dawn. The night had been 12 degrees at sundown, colder by midnight, and then softened toward morning under a south wind that moved through the sugar bush like breath returning to a sleeper. Connie had not planned the final boil for beauty. Work rarely arranges itself for memory. The sap had run hard for 2 days, and she had gathered until her shoulders shook, boiled until steam soaked her hair, skimmed foam by lantern light, and fed the arch with maple splits cut the previous summer. The hydrometer floated true. The thermometer hovered near 7 degrees above the boiling point she had measured for that day. The syrup lifted from the finishing pan in a sheet, not drops, and when she drew the ladle up, amber light clung to its lip before falling back in a slow ribbon. She filtered while hot through clean wool, hands moving faster now because cooling syrup forgave less than cold boards or lime mortar. The first bottle filled with a sound so modest no one outside the room could have known what it meant. Connie set it on the workbench. The glass held dawn before and had entered the windows. It was not the syrup from the crock. It was not borrowed sweetness from a dead man's season. It was her own boil, from trees she had waited to tap, wood she had stacked, fire she had kept, tools she had learned to use without making them pretend they were new. She labelled the bottle by hand. Bélanger Sugar Works. Amber. December 1984. Then she sat down on the floor, not from weakness alone, and let the steam move around her while the arch settled into coals. By then, the interior of the sap house had changed in ways both visible and nearly hidden. The roof no longer answered rain with a bucket. The chimney drew clean, its brickwork still irregular but sound. The white pine floor had darkened under oil and use, with the old paths around the evaporator shining where boots had begun again to turn. The repaired plaster held near the chimney. The windows opened and closed, not easily, but faithfully. The workbench had been levelled. The shelves carried bottles, filters, tin funnels repaired with new solder, sharpened tools, labels, twine, a ledger, and the chipped mug holding pencils instead of sorrow. The copper finishing pan hung on 2 iron hooks above the bench, dent and crescent patch visible in morning light. The spiles rested in a rack Caleb had made from scrap walnut. Etienne's letter remained in the birch bark tube, wrapped now in clean cloth and stored in the tin box when not being read. The flag and medal were kept separately, not hidden, not displayed for strangers, but honoured in a drawer lined with blue wool. On the mantel-shelf sat the smaller brass key from the oak box. For a long while, it opened nothing. Then, in the second spring after the roof repair, when snow had left the ground early and the walnut tree began to leaf, Connie noticed a glint in the trunk above the old horseshoe. It was not iron. It was brass, almost swallowed by bark, set in the wood where a healed seam had closed around it. The plate was no larger than 3 fingers, green with age, and at its centre was a keyhole shaped so narrowly that no ordinary key could have entered. She stood on a flat stone and cleared the bark edges with a wooden pick. Not a knife. The key fit. It resisted first, then turned with a small internal click that seemed too delicate for a tree. A narrow compartment opened inside the trunk, lined in tin and sealed from weather by the living growth that had hidden it. Connie did not breathe for several seconds. Within lay folded 48-star American flag, smaller than the one in the tin box, wrapped in waxed cloth. Beside it was a note written in a woman's hand, dated April 6. None 9 Vencem, the year the United States entered the Great War. To the daughter who comes after me. It began. The note was from Selina Marie Bélanger, the woman in the tint heap, written in English that still carried French order beneath it. She wrote that flags were not only for governments and soldiers, but for houses that sent sons, husbands, brothers, and daughters in the demands of history, and then had to keep supper warm for whoever returned. She wrote that the little flag had hung in the sap house during the war meetings, when neighbours gathered to read newspaper reports and count names. She wrote that she had hidden it in the walnut because some things should not be left to mice, auctions, or the careless hands of grief. There was one line Connie copied into her ledger. A house with daughters must remember forward. She folded the note along its creases, returned the flag to clean cloth, and brought both inside. The key went back on the mantel. The walnut compartment closed again, not as a hiding place now, but as a promise that the living tree had held its part. The military medal travelled with her on November 29, the anniversary date named in the letter. Connie took Bess as far as she could and walked the rest to the cemetery where Etienne, Anna, and the family stone stood under maples older than most houses in town. The ground was hard but not yet frozen deep. She brushed lichen from the edge of Andres' name, though the marker itself remained more memorial than grave. PFC André Gay. Bélanger. 1929-950. Korea. She did not make a speech. She set the bronze star in its cracked case on the stone for the length of one prayer she did not know how to say properly. Reverend Boyd had once told her that proper was less important than present. So she stood present. The wind moved dry leaves against the cemetery wall. Somewhere beyond the hill, a truck shifted gears on the road. Before leaving, she lifted the medal and returned it to her coat pocket. Honour did not cry exposure to weather. The money remained mostly untouched. That surprised some people once they learned of it, though few ever learned enough to ask directly. A cash outside is imagined conversion. Old coins become groceries. Bonds become appliances. Syrup becomes sale. And every hidden thing is expected to hurry into use. Connie had no talent for that kind of hunger. She spent what survival required and left the rest where stewardship could find it. 3 silver coins left Anna's purse in those first years. 1 dime for the maple candy she studied in spring. 1 quarter toward the hydrometer, because accuracy seemed a worthy heir to a roof never bought. $1.50 placed in the church collection plate on the morning after her first successful, not because she had become certain, but because 4 words had walked past her in winter and deserved some answer. Later, a 4th coin paid for a pane of glass after hail cracked the west window during an August storm. She wrote that expenditure in the ledger with the date, weather, and reason. Nothing else from the purse went into ordinary spending. The bond she had assessed properly through the bank, then placed in a safer envelope and left to mature until maturity no longer meant money only. Their face value had been modest. Their instruction was larger. Connie wrote on the outside for the next one, if needed. The tin box returned to the stone-lined pit beneath the cedar disc, though not sealed with pine tar. She added a new oilcloth, a packet of silica wrapped in muslin at Mr. Whitcomb's suggestion, a copy of the deed, a copy of Etienne's letter, her own ledger pages, the remaining coins, and a note explaining what had been spent and why. The pit was no longer grave for tools. It had become a cellar of trust. By the 3rd winter, the shop reopened without announcement. There was no sign in a newspaper, no ribbon, no photograph, no county celebration. Doris put an index card on the cafe cookboard between a notice for laying hens and a church supper. Bélanger Cigar Works, small batch maple syrup, candles later in season, or by mail or at May's Cafe. The handwriting was Doris's, though Connie had supplied the words. Beneath it, someone pinned a second card for names and addresses. By the end of March, there were 43, written in different hands, widows who wanted 1 bottle for Easter breakfast. Family had once known the Bélanger Hill Road, a school teacher from Johnson, a nurse from Morrisville, Silas's sister in Stowe, Reverend Boyd's cousin in New Hampshire, and 3 people Connie had never met who only wrote, "We heard it is good." She filled orders slowly. Each bottle was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Labels run by hand until Mr. Whitcomb found a small used stamp kit that made the work easier but not impersonal. Doris kept a wooden crate behind the cafe counter and refused her percentage except in candles, exact she had declared years before. The candles came late. Connie learned them from Anna's old tapers, from beeswax bought through a beekeeper west of town, from wicks dipped and cooled, until the rhythm entered her wrists. Doris received the first 6, wrapped in paper and tied with red thread. She held them to her nose, closed her eyes, and said nothing for once. That was how Connie knew they were acceptable. Caleb returned the winter he turned 16 with a wooden sign lashed to the side of his father's borrowed truck. He had grown taller in the abrupt way of boys, all wrist and knee before the rest of him caught up. His hair still resisted order. The Schwinn was gone, replaced by work boots and a driver's license folded carefully into his wallet. He carried the sign himself, though Connie took one end because the wood was too good to risk against ice. It was carved from a walnut board, dark and straight, grained, the letters cut by hand and painted cream. Bélanger Cigar Works and Daughters. Connie read it once. Then again. "There are no daughters," she said. Caleb shrugged, but the shrug failed to hide the care in his face. Not yet. I have no children. I know. That makes it inaccurate. He looked toward the sap house, toward the repaired windows and the chimney smoke and the sugar maples waiting beyond. My shop teacher said business puts sons on signs all the time before sons are born. This says daughter. My mother said it should. Connie touched the carved ampersand. The line curved like a handle made for the hand. The word daughters did not mean what it had once meant in county records or family kitchens. Did not point only to blood, nor to marriage, nor to a future Connie was not required to promise. It pointed backward and forward at once, Selina with her draw knife, Anna with her tapers, Lucille silent at table and still not the final word, Mrs. Porter reading a deed aloud, Doris leaving paper bags, a girl on a floor beside heirloom, anyone who might come later needing welcome more than proof. They hung the sign above the sliding door in late afternoon. Silas arrived without being called and claimed the left side was a 1/4 inch low. Mr. Whitcomb brought longer screws. Reverend Boyd stood below with his hands in his pockets and said his 4 words once, so soft the wind nearly took them. Doris watched from the clearing with a thermos of coffee and a basket wrapped in towels. When the final screw went in, the sign held. Not straight enough for a new building. Straight enough for that one. That night, after everyone left and the clearing returned to its own sounds, Connie sat at the workbench with Etienne's letter open beside a blank sheet. She had postponed her own letter because writing to the future felt arrogant until the present had been kept through more than one season. Now the roof had endured storm. The chimney had drawn through hard cold. The floor had carried work. The windows had held against sleet. The tools had made syrup. The shop had reopened in the only way that suited it, quietly, by corkboard and trust. She sharpened a pencil with the draw knife, smiling a little at the impropriety, then began, "My dear one, whoever you are." The words steadied her because they were borrowed honestly. She wrote her name next, then stopped, not because she had nothing to say, but because the first line had opened more than memory. It had opened responsibility. She wrote about the roof, the mortar, the window marked Ensign 88, the granite slab still waiting in the cellar because she had not yet chosen the right day to lift it. She wrote the names of those who had helped without making them owners of her gratitude. Doris, Caleb, Silas, Mr. Whitcomb, Mrs. Porter, Reverend Boyd, Mrs. Leahy from the parish hall, whose bread had travelled further than she could know. She wrote that the tools would be used, not worshipped. She wrote that trees were living records and should be treated with accuracy. She wrote that no one should spend the last coins unless cold. Hunger, repair, or mercy required it. She wrote that welcome did not need be loud to be real. The letter took months. She added to it in different weather, because a house sounds different in rain tan in snow, and truth sometimes waits for the proper seasons before showing its grain. Some pages were practical. Some were almost prayer. One page contained nothing but mistakes she had made and what they cost, because inheritance without warning was only vanity dressed as wisdom. Near the end, she copied Etienne's sentence in her own hand, not because she owned it, but because it had proved true. Some sap houses are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. Years later, people driving the town road would some slow near the second stone culvert, especially in sugaring season, when steam lifted from the cupola and the air carried that unmistakable mingling of wood smoke. Thaw and maple made dents by fire. They might see the walnut sign above the door, the repaired roof, the cleared track, the buckets hung in orderly lines. They might see a woman carrying wood, or a boy now grown helping stack it, or Doris's niece loading a crate of bottles for the cafe. They would not see the first night on the floor. They would not see the dollar laid apart in the clerk's cash box. They would not see the cedar disc lift, the stone-lined pit, the letter unrolled beside a small fire. They would not see a girl learning that a building could ask much of her and still give more than it took. That was all right. Not every kept thing needed public witness. A sap house waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, in a drawer whose runner stuck during damp weather, Mrs. Porter kept the folded dollar long after the count books changed hands. She had written the transfer number on a slip of paper around it, then tucked it beneath the green felt where the brass stamp rested. New clerks came. Forms changed. The old typewriter left the counter. The courthouse walls were painted twice. Still, the dollar remained. Soft from folding, official and unofficial at once. A record of the day a girl bought a condemned sap house for exactly what she had, and found that waiting, when tended, can become a place to stand.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.